Chapter 599. A cold, powerful, and greedy specter of a mecha was floating in the sea of mulberry trees. In order to encircle and annihilate the specter, the rebel army, which had already arrived outside the Libyan planet's atmosphere, had sent a large number of mechas and heavy armored troops into the Sea of Green. While the Governor-General, who controlled the most powerful military on the planet's surface, had been forced to remain silent, the rebel army could sweep through the entire planet. However, in front of the Spectre mecha, in the sea of mulberry trees where day and night alternated, the mechas and heavy armored troops suddenly felt like they had changed from being hunters to being hunted. They were confused and panicked until their hearts were shaken and they were secretly trembling in fear. Between dawn and dusk, the cold rainy night, and the scorching sun at noon, the mechas and heavy armored troops of the rebel army seemed to be under attack all the time. The mulberry leaves swayed in the wind, dispersing the shadows. A few cunning rabbits fled in panic among the weeds. The mechas that were carrying out reconnaissance missions or were alone were instantly destroyed by the Spectre mecha. Then, they were miserably torn apart into wreckage. It looked like their internal organs had been devoured by primitive barbarians who believed in demons. The main army of the rebel army had approached the Spectre mecha many times, but the Spectre mecha had used some unknown method to silently disappear from its original spot, leaving behind only the monotonous sea of mulberry trees, which was so dull that it made one's eyes go numb. It made a rustling sound, as if it was mocking the futility of these people. More and more mechas of the rebel army were destroyed in the encirclement. Not a single mecha could escape or even withstand the sneak attack of the Spectre mecha for a few seconds. Once they encountered the Spectre mecha, they would die. This shadow, which was like a curse, shrouded the entire encirclement army. When they thought about the identity and legend of the person in the cockpit of the Spectre mecha, the rebels could not help but feel extremely tense. The mecha was called Peach Miasma, but its body was painted with the black hibiscus flower that represented the imperial family of the empire. It moved like a specter through the dense, green mulberry forest. Most of the metal boxes hanging from the joints had been destroyed, and 70% of the original alloy armor had been destroyed. Instead, it had been replaced with armor that had been picked up from somewhere. There were still clear traces of the use of high-temperature cutting guns and welding guns on the armor plates. The outer armor, which looked like beggars' clothes, was sprayed with oil sputtering lines. Together with the damage marks left behind by the fierce battle, it looked like a painting of the galaxy's sect, which was famous for its ugliness and fury. The Peach Miasma mecha, which had never contributed anything in terms of aesthetics, now looked more like a walking pile of metal garbage than ever before. The internal components of the mecha had already been repaired countless times. Who knew how many parts had been swapped out? Those temporary replacement parts were helplessly wearing themselves down, letting out a sad, low grinding sound. The two slender mechanical legs, nearly 3 meters tall, were unable to ensure an absolutely precise dynamic balance because they had collected the spherical joints of two different mecha. Every time it moved forward at high speed, the Peach Miasma mecha would always tilt its body like a walking pile of metal trash. Suddenly, it looked a little like a poor, crippled metal patient. To make this mech that looked like it would fall apart at any moment move, to the point where it was close to going on strike countless times, only to once again let out a low rumble, and even to the point where it could continue to fight for many days and nights in a row. To be able to do all this was naturally thanks to the mechanic jointly cultivated by the Federal Nutshell Company and Uncle Fengyu. The joys and sorrows of humans were not the same. The joys and sorrows of the people of the Federation and the people of the Empire were diametrically opposite. Fortunately, both sides had absolutely similar thinking patterns and the same baffling units of measurement and design concepts. Even the operation of the simple maintenance arm seemed to be the same. Even with Huai Caoshi's translation, Su Lu could not fully understand the technical parameters on the Imperial Mecha's components. However, when his hands touched the cold handle of the maintenance arm and pressed the switch, he very quickly began to familiarize himself with all the machinery, or rather, everything related to metal. And he fixed it. He even used the limited components to modify a Rebel Army electronic mecha station that the Peach Miasma mecha had destroyed. Although he did not succeed in infiltrating the Rebel Army's command system, he greatly improved the Peach Miasma mecha's electronic shielding ability. In the instant he completed the modification, Su Lu thought of that truly amazing electronics expert he had met. Thinking of Gu Shifeng's 10 plump fingers, he silently assessed that among the ranks of normal combat forces, the Empire's electronics technology level was far inferior to the Federation's. The Rebel Army encirclement and suppression forces in the Mulberry Tree Sea were shocked and even terrified by the fact that the Peach Miasma mecha was like a specter, as if it would never have any mechanical problems. No matter how many intense mecha battles it experienced, the next time it appeared, it would still be in perfect condition. Although the Spectre mecha seemed to be becoming more and more tattered, the combat strength it displayed did not decrease in the slightest. The Rebel Army could not understand how the other had done this. Even though the staff officers had deduced some things from the pieces of the Moon Wolf mecha, they still found it hard to believe that there was someone in this universe who could complete this kind of repair work that required expensive and heavy equipment in this absolutely agricultural region. Moreover, the other party had completely used the parts of the Moon Wolf mecha to repair it. The Rebel Army officers gradually developed a misconception that the Highness they were currently encircling was not fighting alone. In this vast sea of mulberry trees, there seemed to be a large logistics base operating continuously, providing an unending stream of powerful support for the Highness's Spectre mecha. However, this sea of mulberry trees had already been swept clean by the Rebel Army. Where could there possibly be a large logistics base? Huai Chaosher had not made any comments regarding the level of mecha repair Su Lu had displayed these past few days. That ordinary face of hers did not even reveal a trace of emotion, but deep down, she was already deeply shaken. She knew that this Federation man beside her was an extremely powerful soldier, even qualified to engage in a fair mecha battle with her. However, she did not care about any of this. Her valiant strength and self-confidence were enough to support her contempt for Su Lu. However, seeing how the Peach Miasma mecha had actually managed to hold out for so many days under this seemingly ordinary pair of hands, she could not help but feel admiration. Amidst the admiration was a strong sense of wariness. Amidst the wariness was confusion, the same confusion as those Rebel Army officers. The Federation's mecha research was not that far ahead of the Empire's. The level of the industry determined the level of operation. Huai Chaosher could not understand how this person had managed to develop such inconceivable mecha repair skills. Could it be that this kind of thing also required talent? Watch the game. That's all. I forgot to mention it yesterday, so I'll make up for it today. After reading what I've written these past few days, I feel quite good. Has my excitement threshold dropped? Haha, it's been a long time since I've done something narcissistic. Today, I've ruined my own character for Spain. Chapter 601. While Huai Chaosher was secretly shocked by Su Li's mechanical skills, Su Li's heart was also filled with endless admiration and even fear for her. He had never seen such a person in his life. Other than focusing on mechanical repair work, Su Lu had always maintained a normal rest because his weak body was constantly on the alert. However, Huai Chaosher, who was in charge of operating the Peach Miasma mecha, not only had to escape the pursuit of the rebel forces, she also had to constantly launch sneak attacks on the enemy's mecha. She had no time to rest at all. During the many days of tense escape, Su Lu had never seen this Highness be able to maintain a high level of concentration, even if she closed her eyes once. There was not even a trace of fatigue to be seen. The rebel forces outside Li Banstar's atmosphere, after taking control of the Red Rose, continuously released troops into the sea of mulberry trees. It was like an endless wave, constantly slapping against the black reef, each wave higher than the last, each wave stronger than the last. However, Huai Chaosher, who did not have the slightest time to rest, controlled the Peach Miasma mecha to calmly and almost indifferently withstand all of these attacks. Humans are the first order of machines. Su Li's heart once again rang out with the uncle's words. The more time he spent with them, the more shocked he became. So there really was an existence like steel in this world. The tattered mecha moved at high speed through the dark forest. A young man and young woman in tattered clothes were silent in the dark cockpit. The roaring peach miasma broke through the heavy infantry barrier of the Exayama Hills. Under the torrential rain, the encirclement only left behind violent battle shadows. A certain Empire rebel army division that had urgently parachuted into the sea of mulberry trees was suddenly attacked by the peach miasma as soon as they arrived on the ground. The division commander died, tragically in a decapitation plan, for the promise of dying with dignity, for the responsibility of the country, for some completely different reasons. Su Lu and Huai Chaoshu worked hand in hand. Day after day, they continued to escape and counterattack. Tense repairs and fierce battles became their entire lives. The nobles who had betrayed the imperial family could not have imagined, nor could the madly searching for Her Highness the Princess in the Mulberry Sea. In truth, no one could have imagined that once the two most extraordinary individuals of the younger generation of the Federation and the Empire joined hands, they would erupt with such astonishing battle strength and accomplish an almost inconceivable goal. In the wee hours of the morning, the peach miasma mecha, which had narrowly escaped the first aerial attack of the rebel army, welcomed a rare moment of temporary rest. The powerful highness, like a demon, did not need to rest, but the soldiers of the rebel army could not endure this kind of intense battle. The morning light was dim, unable to spread across the entire land. The fog around the stream greatly reduced visibility. The tattered peach miasma mech silently crouched on the rocky ground beside the stream. Su Lu crouched beside the stream and splashed a handful of stream water on his stubbled face. The cold stream water flowed down his tangled dirty hair, spreading from his neck to his naked upper body. It made his body tremble, and he felt much more awake. He could not help but smile happily. Looking back, Huai Chaoshu was silently looking at the electronic manual in her hands, the pen between her fingers moving incessantly. She should be conducting some kind of communication. The silk coat she wore had long been torn to shreds, and she had changed into a mecha combat uniform. It had not been washed for many days, and the sour smell seemed to be coming from it from afar. Paired with that face full of dust, she did not look like a noble princess at all. Through hunting the rebel army's mecha, they knew some of the situation on Liban planet, especially after Su Lu successfully repaired the electronic mecha's equipment. Huai Chaoshu contacted even more of her loyal subordinates. She had a better understanding of the current situation and the inside story of this shocking assassination. The rebel fleet had already taken control of the outer space around Liban planet. Although they lacked long-range attacking battleships and were unable to control the situation on the entire planet, they had successfully cut off the connection between Tianjin and Liban planet. Now, no one knew what exactly had happened on Tianjin planet, or whether the emperor, who was in that vast and magnificent palace complex, was still doing well. This was the first rebellion led by the nobles in the empire's 100 years of history. Compared to the rebellion of the commoners and slaves, the nobles' rebel army had more resources and more powerful military force. The situation on Liban planet was dangerous and strange. A few great lords had already successively surrendered to the rebel army, but the numerous mechanized divisions under the control of the governor's office, the most powerful army on the planet, had maintained a strange silence, as if they did not know what was happening on the planet, nor did they see the fleets showing off their prowess outside the atmosphere. Through the information sent by the Intelligence Bureau's subordinates, along with Su Li's previous analysis, Huai Chaoshu guessed the reason for the current situation. The governor's office should have been controlled by the rebel army, but Governor Coup Bowning did not surrender. The rebel army was worried that killing him would trigger a counterattack from the governor's office, so they left him alive. Probably only an idiot like Lewis would do such a stupid thing. He succeeded in ambushing the governor's office, but now he's stuck in a mud. Huai Chaoshu thought expressionlessly. Then her eyebrows slightly furrowed as she thought of the key information sent by her subordinates. It was from these few pieces of information that she found out something that she did not understand after she was ambushed. Even though the empire's reforms in the past few years had harmed the interests of some of the great nobles, under the powerful pressure of her father, these nobles still dared to launch a rebellion so hastily. They actually think that I killed Duke Carleton. Huai Chaoshi subconsciously looked at the stream. That man from the Federation was currently bathing in the stream with his upper body naked, revealing a mouthful of neat white teeth, smiling somewhat irritatingly. If he knew that he killed Duke Carleton and caused such a huge disturbance in the Empire, would he still be so carefree and happy? No, he would be happier, Huai Chaoshi thought unhappily with her eyebrows furrowed. Su Lu felt her gaze and scratched his head in confusion. He walked out of the stream, his bare feet stepping on the hard stones, and walked in front of her. He calmly stood in front of Huai Chaoshi, not in a hurry to grab clothes to cover his naked upper body, because after that luxurious silk coat was turned into silk, there was not a single piece of clothing on him, and he also did not have the habit of taking off clothes from the dead rebel soldiers to wear. The more important reason was that Su Lu found it very difficult to see this princess in front of him as the opposite sex, so there was nothing unnatural about it. There was once a joke. A man resentfully asked a strong woman, "Why are you so unlike a woman?" That woman coldly replied, "Because you are too unlike men." In front of a strong woman like Huai Chaoshi, most men would probably have a hard time finding a clear sense of gender. The question you asked last time, I can answer you now. Huai Chaoshi looked into his eyes and calmly said, "His Majesty is not dead." The information channels in the direction of Tianjing were sealed. The people on Libenstar had no idea what happened there, and she, who was in the sea of mulberry trees, had no information to confirm. However, it was precisely this suffocating silence that allowed her to confirm the Emperor's safety. If the rebel army really succeeded in assassinating the ruler of Zhuotianstar region, how could it be so quiet? For you, this should be good news. After a slight pause, Su Lu said, "But it won't be of much help to our escape. I have to warn you again, this peach miasma mecha won't be able to last much longer. There's already a problem with the central wiring of the multi-engine storage room. I am a mechanic, not a magician. Once this type of core component is damaged, apart from replacing it, there is no other way. The problem is that we don't have any large-scale equipment that can be disassembled. Even if we do, in the entire sea of mulberry trees, there's no trace of any new Wolf Fong mecha." He spread out his hands, stared into her eyes, and asked seriously, "How many more days do we have to flee in this damned sea of mulberry trees before your people can come to our rescue?" Huai Chaoshi was silent for a long time. She didn't directly answer this question, only saying, "The longer, the better." Su Li's eyes narrowed, and he frowned. "You want to delay a little longer?" Huai Chaoshi smiled slightly. As long as the Emperor wasn't dead, the rebel army wouldn't be able to completely control the situation. As long as the situation on Tianjing planet stabilized, the powerful royal fleet would be able to easily solve the problems on Li Ban planet like a knife cutting through paper. Huai Chaoshi had persevered in this treacherous sea of mulberry trees with extraordinary perseverance and perseverance. Even though her subordinates had already prepared to help her escape 3 days ago, she still didn't leave. She was stalling for time. Only if she was alive and proved to the governor's office that she was still alive through battle would Governor Ku Baoning continue to persevere. So that's how it is. Hearing Huai Chaoshi's calm explanation, Su Lu said, "If things really develop as you think, that Governor Ku Baoning will definitely be killed by the crazy and desperate nobles. I think that Governor Ku Baoning should have the self-awareness to sacrifice himself for the Empire," Huai Chaoshi said coldly. Su Lu shook his head. He casually picked up a rock beside her and sat down. Using his hand to cover his mouth, he began to cough silently and painfully again. The desperate battle in the sea of mulberry trees came to an abrupt end on a sunny afternoon. The rebel army, whose hearts and minds were filled with excitement and fear, finally succeeded in forcing the ghost mecha to reveal itself. Under the encirclement of countless heavy weapons, the tattered peach miasma mecha was like a frightened metal statue, silently stopping in the middle of a farm. However, there was no one inside the peach miasma mecha. The spy from the Royal Intelligence Bureau who had infiltrated the rebel army, at the cost of his life, had successfully lured a small gap into the rebel army's encirclement. After receiving the latest information, Huai Chaoshi resolutely abandoned the mecha she relied on to shock the universe and sweep through the wilderness. She and Su Lu braved the great danger and followed the gap, following a secret path in the sea of mulberry trees to arrive at a silk processing factory in the southwest. Chapter 602. An official of the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency, disguised as a foreign trader in a silk processing factory, or more accurately, a foreign trader in a silk processing factory who worked for the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency, received two extremely skinny young men in tattered clothes at the sewers outside the walls of an unassuming silk processing factory. The merchant didn't dare to look directly at these two targets of his, nor did he dare to discuss them in his heart. He only dared to lower his head and respectfully lead them past the walls, arriving at a small, dark, and remote room. Only then did he dare to raise his hand to wipe the sweat off his forehead. He then turned around and knelt down. In a trembling voice, he said, "Your Highness, we have failed in our work, causing your Highness to be in danger for so many days. We truly deserve to die." Huai Chaoshi didn't recognize this merchant. She hadn't been in charge of the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency for long, and hadn't even seen all of the officials in charge of the various prefectural planets, let alone this merchant, who was only an unassuming fourth-rank liaison officer on Li Banstar. They hadn't been able to discover the plot of the noble's betrayal in advance, and they hadn't been able to warn them in advance, causing Her Highness to be surrounded by the rebel army. This was the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency's greatest humiliation, as well as its greatest fear. If Her Highness had really been harmed in this rebellion, the grief of His Majesty and the anger of the populace would probably cause thousands of officials to lose their jobs, or even die. We'll investigate the responsibility later. What are the next arrangements? Huai Chaoshi didn't give any warm words of encouragement to her subordinates in this tense moment. She said in an extremely cold voice, "Has there been any news from Tianjing Planet?" The information channel should have already been opened. The merchant wiped the cold sweat off his forehead again. "But this subordinate's rank is too low, so I'm unable to access the information." Huai Chaoshi clearly wasn't satisfied with this answer. The merchant continued respectfully. "The Li Ban branch office has drawn up 17 escape routes around the Mulberry Sea. All the preparations outside have already been made to receive Her Highness as she leaves. The problem now is how to withdraw from these routes." "Haven't the rebels been moved away?" Huai Chaoshi asked with a frown. "All the factories in Mulberry Sea are under the control of the rebel army, especially the commercial routes and air routes. The control is very strict. I used some methods to get into this place, but this basic silk workshop is still 7 kilometers away from the next meeting point." The merchant looked at her feet in fear and said, "Most of the rebel army's mobile troops have been sent away by the wrong information, but there is still a heavy infantry battalion on this 7-kilometer road." Su Lu had been listening attentively to the conversation between Huai Chaoshi and the Imperial Intelligence officer. He noticed that the officer's tongue was always curled when he spoke. It was somewhat pleasant to hear, but his trembling voice made him seem particularly fearful. His proficiency in the language of the Empire was rather mediocre, so it was not easy for him to understand the heavily accented sentences. Only then did he realize that he was still in danger. "What do we do next?" he asked. Huai Chaoshi replied calmly, "Of course we're going to break through. That's a heavy infantry battalion, and we don't have mechas." Su Lu frowned and asked in unfamiliar Imperial language, "Why don't we try other routes?" "Because we don't have time." Huai Chaoshi turned her head and looked at him indifferently. Su Lu shrugged and did not express any more opinions. But when a merchant saw this scene, he was somewhat shocked. There is actually someone in this world who dared to use such a tone to speak to Her Highness? This person who spoke with a lisp, as if he had not spoken for many years. What was his background? Is this a level 4 stronghold? Huai Chaoshu no longer paid attention to Su Lu and asked the merchant. The merchant lowered his head and replied, Your Highness, this is a level 2 stronghold. Very good. Huai Chaoshu raised her eyebrows and said in a clear voice, Since this is a level 2 stronghold, then you should immediately prepare your firearms. The merchant and Su Lu were both stunned at the same time. Looking at this person with a thin face, they both thought that she was really going to take a gun and rush into that heavy infantry battalion. I want a lot of guns, big guns. Huai Chaoshu added. No matter how many guns a person had on his back, it was impossible for it to be as dense as a forest. But if she had 3 Gatling guns on her back, then the bullets would be more dense and violent than a rainstorm. The high-speed and sharp bullets were shot out from the rough barrels of the Gatling guns, accompanied by a pungent, burnt smell and the strange smell of the cold system. The bullets tore the air above the grassy slope and formed countless terrifying rays, blasting the barracks in front of them into countless pieces of smoke and dust. With a pale face, Su Lu followed the moving, human-shaped barracks in front of him and quickly ran forward. Looking at this scene, he couldn't help but think of a prehistoric monster that kept spitting out flames, and it was a female. Huai Chaoshu was not very beautiful, but if she washed her cheeks clean, she could be considered delicate and pretty. She did not look like those terrifying prehistoric monsters at all. However, a skinny woman carrying 3 heavy Gatling guns and madly shooting while running, with clear muscle traces faintly visible on her arms under the military sleeves, such a terrifying woman could no longer be considered a woman, or even a human. Mother of Asterisk Kerr, what a monster! Su Lu subconsciously muttered, but his voice was immediately covered by the deafening gunshots. In the eyes of the Federal forces and the Empire soldiers who had fought with him before, he was without a doubt a monster. But now, he realized that this princess was even more of a monster than he was. How could such a skinny body contain such terrifying power? The Empire's Gatling guns were as famous as the Federation's Darlin cannons. They were extremely heavy, and in addition to the huge amount of ammunition required to continuously fire, anyone could estimate the weight of the guns to be jaw-dropping. But Huai Chaoshu lifted them up as if they were light. Using her skinny body to carry a moving ammunition depot, she launched an attack at a heavy infantry barracks. What did you say? Huai Chaoshu's slender waist turned slightly, and the 3 Gatling guns on her back roared as they changed their angle, blasting the military vehicle 300 meters away into pieces, causing a small explosion. I said, I have muscles too, Su Lu replied loudly with some anger. At this moment, he thought of Xiong Linquan, the Xiong Linquan who was as strong as an overlord, but could only carry 1 Darlin cannon. The 3 heavy Terran heavy machine guns were thrown into the pond, creating a huge wave. The fishes in the pond fled in all directions in fear. When the hot gun barrels came into contact with the slightly cold pond water, a sizzling sound was heard, and a few puffs of white smoke rose. A few intelligence officers disguised as workers nervously removed the empty magazines from Huai Chaoshu's body, but they almost hit their own feet. After successfully breaking through, it should be said that they unreasonably destroyed the outermost line of defense of the rebel army in Mulberry Sea. Huai Chaoshu and Su Lu followed the intelligence officers who had been waiting for a long time on a single-track freight train and arrived at the next rendezvous point as quickly as possible. They boarded a small interplanetary spaceship. Chapter 603. Beep, 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 beep. Along with the piercing sound of the alarm, a startling red symbol appeared on the screen beside the cabin door. It was similar to a bug animation, alerting the people in the spaceship that the surveillance system had discovered a chip behind the neck of a Federation member. The Imperial Intelligence Bureau officers disguised as silk smugglers reacted quickly. In a fraction of a second, they pulled out the guns at their waists, blocking Huai Chaoshu and Wang Zhong behind them. The black muzzles of the guns aimed in all directions, while the communication system on their wrists rang with the sounds of data analysis and tracking. A few seconds later, the officers put down the guns in their hands with extremely strange expressions. Looking at the small-eyed man behind the princess, they realized that the source of the alarm was actually this person. This person was actually a member of the Federation. The officers thought back to the time when the spaceship was leaving Bamban Star, and countless questions arose in their hearts. Could it be that the rumor of the aristocratic rebellion was true? Turn down the sound of the alarm system. Huai Chaoshu frowned slightly. Taking a step forward, she said in a cold voice, "I don't want to hear these ear-piercing sounds on the way back to Tianjing." Su Lu followed her forward, shrugging his shoulders at the strange expressions of the imperial officials on both sides of the cabin door, expressing his innocence. He was slightly disappointed that the princess did not order her subordinates to turn off the chip scanning system. This also proved that although the princess was known as the most ferocious person in the universe, she was still cautious and meticulous in her actions. With her hands behind her back, Huai Chaoshu stared coldly at her subordinates as they replaced the electrically controlled explosives on Su Li's shoulders. She was still unwilling to relax until her subordinates painstakingly found a set of heavy, electrically shocked alloy shackles and placed them on Su Li's ankles. Only then did she truly relax and slowly straighten her body. Su Lu watched as her eyes slowly narrowed, like a book with a black cover that was about to be closed. Suddenly, his eyebrows jumped and he said, "Don't fall." Huai Chaoshu suddenly opened her eyes and stared at him. "What did you say? Don't fall." Su Lu acted as if he did not feel her sharp gaze and said firmly, "Don't forget what you promised me." What did he promise? A dignified death or a dignified life? Huai Chaoshu frowned slightly. After a moment, he thought of something and a rare, gentle smile appeared on his lips. He pointed at Su Lu on the chair with his right hand and said to the subordinates around him, "As long as he doesn't run away, treat him well." "Yes, Your Highness," the intelligence officer on the spaceship answered without hesitation. Hearing this, Su Lu was truly relieved. His feet that were tightly bound by heavy shackles moved as if he was scratching an itch. Then, seeing Huai Chaoshu slowly narrowing her eyes again, he reminded the officials of the Imperium around him, "Hold her." The officials of the Empire did not know what this person from the Federation meant. More importantly, they had never imagined that Her Highness, who was standing by the porthole of the warship, would fall one day despite her slim figure and the feeling that she was invincible. Her Highness, who was about to become great because of her strength alone, would fall one day. That was why their reaction was a step slower. Huai Chaoshu's narrowed eyes finally closed gently. With the touch of her single eyelid, the eternally burning crystal engine furnace seemed to have been turned off. She still had her hands behind her back and proudly and calmly stuck out her chest. Maintaining this cool posture, she fell backwards. With a muffled bang, she fell head first onto the ground of the spaceship, making it tremble slightly. Cries of disbelief and angry shouts erupted from all around. The officials of the Imperial Intelligence Department rushed over as fast as they could. A moment later, they discovered with some lingering fear and some disbelief that Her Highness was not injured at all. She had just fallen asleep. The nervous officials escorted Her Highness to rest and hurriedly opened the healing pod. Meanwhile, the officials who stayed in the pod looked at Su Lu with strange expressions. On the surface, they did not understand the true relationship between this Federation member and Her Highness. On the surface, they did not understand why this person could see that Her Highness was about to fall. Su Lu lowered his head. His gaze followed the explosives on his shoulder and landed on the heavy alloy shackles. The corners of his lips curled into a smile. After fleeing and fighting for so many days in that sea of mulberry trees without a moment of rest, even a true metal body was probably about to collapse. After entering the spaceship, Huai Chaoshu confirmed that she was temporarily safe. Once her mind relaxed, the fatigue and injuries gushed out like a flood. How could she not fall? If she still did not fall, in front of such a terrifying enemy, Su Lu would really lose all hope. Fortunately, she fell in the end. The Empire was a society with a strict hierarchy. The 5 classes of royalty, nobles, commoners, peasants, and slaves were divided quite clearly. In the vast space era, the Empire was still able to maintain its imperial power. The Empire's royalty relied on the oppression from the top to the bottom and the incomparably bloody strength to maintain order. The history of the Empire was actually a history of suppression and resistance. The history of the Empire gradually turned the peasants and slaves into a class, the most miserable class. In recent history, the most miserable class in the Empire Star region had already become the Federation members. Although the number of Federation members who were captured and brought into the Empire was extremely small, this type of object that even the peasants and slaves could spit and throw eggs at on the streets could only compete with pigs and dogs for the treatment they enjoyed. The Federation members were the best targets for the peasants and slaves to vent their dissatisfaction. They were the supreme weapon that maintained the stability of the Empire's society, the bright light that guided the Empire forward. Thus, they naturally became the most unshakable part of the Empire's strict order. Anyone, regardless of whether they were the peasants struggling in the slums or the slaves with their backs to the sky in the mines, had already been nurtured an instinctive hatred for the Federation members, a fanatical bloodlust. Their existence was not necessarily reasonable, but they definitely had reasonable needs. If Sulu had not snatched those words out of Huai Caoshi's mouth before she fell asleep, one could imagine how miserable his treatment on the disguised spaceship of the Intelligence Bureau would have been. Just like the two Imperial experts on the Red Rose, the officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau would not have minded slowly tormenting him as an experiment subject until there was not a single part of his body left unscathed, his organs and limbs torn apart, leaving only his last breath to swallow the past to the heroes of the Federation. Fortunately, at the top of the strict order of the Empire was the Imperial authority that could not be challenged. Since the princess had spoken, even the lowliest Federation member would instantly become a guest that must be treated well. No matter how unwilling the officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau were, they had to do it, because the princess would wake up from her deep sleep one day. The disguised smuggler spaceship used some unknown method to break through the blockade of the star system by the rebel fleet. It traveled long and far in the dark and silent space, following the top-secret smuggling route shared by the Silk Smugglers and the Imperial Intelligence Bureau, getting further and further away from the turbulent planet. In these days, the standard meals in space, the delicious hand-ground coffee of the Empire, the language of the Empire became clearer and clearer, the novels of the Empire that were used to pass the time, and the sentences in the novels that were difficult to understand gradually became easier to understand. This was Su Li's life on the spaceship. If the heavy shackles on his ankles had not rubbed his skin to the point of bleeding, and if the explosives piercing through his shoulder blade had not been so painful, he would have been able to enjoy the journey. Other than that, he had been silently observing the actions of the officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau. He watched as the officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau dealt with the rebel fleet, talked to the smuggling bosses hidden in the darkness, and escorted Huai Caoshi away from dangers seemingly dangerous, but actually casually. He could not help but feel more and more shocked. The Imperial Intelligence Bureau, an intelligence agency that was very similar to the Bureau of Proclamation but did not have a charter computer, displayed too much ability. The intelligence of countless spies was like the information feedback of the Federation's ubiquitous chips. If the Federation's the glory of the Charter relied on the powerful computing power of the central computer and the ubiquitous information nodes, then the Imperial Intelligence Bureau used to rule the universe relied on people everywhere, people like the sea, people like the mountains, people like the vast ocean, people like the mountains, people like the mountains, people like the vast ocean, people like the mountains. 11 days had passed in the Empire's standard time, and Sulu was once again deeply shocked by the scene that appeared on the screen. Covering the sky and covering the sun was not enough to describe the fleet in space ahead. In fact, when this fleet of hundreds of Empire's battleships suddenly appeared in front of the interstellar passage, the entire universe seemed to be swallowed up by the densely packed fleet of battleships. The black hibiscus logo on the front of these battleships was so eye-catching that it made people shudder. The terrifying Empire's royal fleet finally left the space base outside of Tianjing planet. They brushed past the lone Imperial Intelligence Bureau's spaceship, leaving behind 10 battleships as protection, while the rest of the battleships all rushed towards Liban Planet. A few days later, images of space around Liban Planet appeared on the screen. Countless silent explosions and dazzling fireworks ballooned one after another in that area of space. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he watched all this. He realized that the Intelligence Bureau's officers beside him did not have any excited expressions. Perhaps in the eyes of these officers, who were extremely loyal to the imperial family, this aristocratic rebellion was a joke. As long as His Majesty and Her Highness were still alive, these reactionaries would be torn to pieces sooner or later. "What are you thinking about?" A voice sounded behind him. Sulu subconsciously opened his mouth. He spoke in the Empire's language, but he immediately realized that the person behind him was speaking in the Federation's language. On this spaceship, there was only one person who spoke to him in the Federation's language. He turned his head and looked at the ordinary face that no one dared to underestimate. He smiled and said, "You're awake." "Yes." Huai Chaoshi carried a cup of coffee and walked to the side of the chair. She looked at the balls of flames on the screen and said, "It seems like there is something wrong with your mood. Liban Planet is a sea of fire. I don't know how many people will die. Can that governor survive?" "I just received bad news. Governor Ko Bowning has already died for his country." After a moment of silence, Sulu said, "I thought of that officer who surrounded us in the sea of mulberry trees that day. Although I can't completely understand your conversation, I still feel pity for him. Your aristocrats seem to like posturing, but they don't understand that posturing can always easily lead to death." Huai Chaoshi put down the cup of coffee and said, "You don't understand. I really don't understand. For example, why did that Governor Ko Bowning, who clearly knew that he was going to die, persist for you and your imperial father? Your president is a puppet of vote politics, but over here, His Majesty is the Empire." This discussion ends here. Sulu was silent again. Suddenly, he asked, "Can you explain to me the composition of the Empire's fleet that is going to quell this rebellion?" The two of them weren't the only ones in the room. Those officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau who were quietly working had actually been carefully listening to the conversation between Her Highness and that person from the Federation. Their profession meant that the Federation language was a compulsory subject, so they heard this conversation clearly. The first part of the conversation shocked them that the high and mighty Her Highness would speak to that lowly Federation citizen in a tone of equality, but the last part really gave them the urge to immediately kill Sulu. The composition of the Empire's fleet, whether it was the crudest ratio of functional ships or the most subtle increase in firepower, was, without a doubt, top-secret information. Even the average aristocrat didn't have the qualifications to access this information, let alone ask a person from the Federation. The spaceship was silent. The officers of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau thought that Her Highness would perhaps fly into a thunderous rage, or perhaps unexpectedly not give any response. However, Huai Caoshi's following response was already beyond their understanding. "This fleet is the Heavenly Thunder Fleet. It belongs to the First Royal Fleet. The flagship, Songlei, is powered by 21 sets of compound engines. Its armor is 3 layers of increasing thickness." Huai Chaoshi was silent for a moment before she began to calmly explain the Empire's military's absolute secret information. It was as if she had completely forgotten that Sulu in the chair was a soldier from the Federation. The entire spaceship's officers were dumbfounded. Apart from her voice, there was a deathly silence. Even a night cat walking past could hear the thunderous footsteps. Only Sulu noticed the flash of light in Huai Caoshi's eyes. He was also the only one who understood why Huai Caoshi dared to tell him these things. "What you're asking isn't anything important." Huai Chaoshi finished explaining the composition of the fleet and lowered her head to look at Sulu with a smile, her face full of confidence. "Are there really laser weapons in the outer space bases of Tianjin? We've been guessing this all this time," Sulu continued to ask without holding back. "You'll naturally find out when you have the ability to attack." Huai Chaoshi put her hands behind her back and said calmly, "However, I can give you a rough estimate of the firepower. According to the defensive capabilities of your fleet, they should be able to hold on for more than 17 seconds. What about the Wolf Fong mecha? Although the micro-engines in the 47 spherical joints can avoid the interference of the electronic turbulence in the containment chamber, how can they achieve synchronization? The quiet smuggling spaceship headed towards Tianjing planet. The voices of two youths, who appeared ordinary on the outside but were, in fact, prouder and more confident than anyone else, rang out in the quiet cabin. This conversation lasted for an unknown period of time. They talked about the Empire's military deployment, Tianjing planet's culture, the most famous food among the Empire's people, and the most direct answers to the most direct questions. Between the questions and answers, there was an atmosphere like that of sword brewing. In the sea of mulberry trees, Su Lu and Huai Chaosher had already discussed this. This was just pushing the discussion one step further. You say that you want to escape, but you're just asking for trouble. She knew that he would definitely want to escape. She knew that the moment he escaped, he would cause even greater harm to the Empire. However, she insisted on saying this because she firmly believed that he wouldn't be able to escape. On the contrary, the more he knew, the more he wanted to escape but couldn't. This was a very interesting gamble. Sulu, the man who was already hanging upside down on the gallows, had steel chips tied to his hair. With every sentence that Huai Chaosher said, the chips would increase until they were thousands of tons, tens of thousands, tens of millions of tons like seawater. Actually, you don't have to make this gamble with me. The royal battleships around the spaceship dispersed like ghosts, and a blurry nebula appeared in the distance. Sula knew if that was their destination. After ending today's discussion and gaining a preliminary understanding of the Empire's literary history, he suddenly spoke to Huai Chaosher beside him. I never gamble. Huai Chaosher narrowed her eyes at the nebula that was only the size of a fingernail and said, since the start of the war, there have been a total of 27 Federation prisoners who pretended to surrender and then tried to escape. Among them, there were many who were much more cunning and powerful than you, but not a single one of them was able to escape more than 3 kilometers from the surface of the planet. Sulu was silent, knowing the reason she was talking about. Huai Chaosher coldly glanced at the back of Su Li's neck, a hint of disgust appearing in her eyes. She said mockingly, just like how we can't enter the Federation, you guys can't either. To have a machine implant a dog's tail in your body, I really don't know what you Federation people are thinking. Sula laughed, not intensely arguing with the other over the issue of the chip. Instead, he said, this isn't something I can choose or decide. I sympathize with you and all of you. Huai Chaosher frowned slightly and said, that's why I really don't understand why a guy like you can still laugh so happily as death draws closer and closer. I don't believe that you really have the confidence to escape. Of course, her pair of straight eyebrows raised slightly, and she said with narrowed eyes, I'm looking forward to the surprises you can bring me. Could this be the so-called loneliness of the experts? Su Lu scratched his head, his shoulder hurting a little, and his brows furrowed. Probably so, Huai Chaosher replied. In a magnificent interstellar era, the individual heroism supported by super strength had long since given way to the cold mechanical order. Under such a background, anyone who dared to express their feelings of invincibility to the princess by the porthole could most likely be classified as a lunatic or a pretentious idiot. However, history was so long, and the human population was so large, so there would always be peerless experts who had the qualifications to say such words. For example, Li Pifu, or the person who had his teeth smashed by Li Pifu. For example, him, her, and him. I'll do my best. Sula looked into her eyes and replied with the most serious tone he had ever used in his life. The spaceship landed on a huge planet, and the bulletproof limousine led the group out of the secret royal military base. After driving for about 70 kilometers, they entered a heavily guarded manor. Su Lu, who was wearing the helmet of darkness, could not see anything and could not even hear anything. All of this was completely based on the inference in his mind. The acceleration of gravity during landing, the speed felt by his body, and the time silently counted in his mind. Everything was just inference. Stepping on the protruding round stone road, Su Lu was dragged forward by the dynasty's soldiers. He suddenly said, "I still have a very important question to ask about that Ba Dao." He knew that Huai Chaosher definitely had not left yet. If she wanted to leave, she would definitely say something to him. Sure enough, a moment later, he heard that person's cold and calm voice. "I'll tell you before you die." Sulu smiled and did not say anything else. Huai Chaosher narrowed her eyes and looked at the back of the figure that disappeared into the underground passage. For some reason, she felt a little strange in her heart. Not because of this bet that she thought she would definitely win, but because of something else. On the way back to the core of the Empire on the Wild Rose, she needed to know Su Li's secret at all costs. However, after receiving a complete analysis of the information, she immediately withdrew the idea of chopping off this person's arm. This was because she firmly believed that with this person's seemingly dull but actually firm temperament, once faced with such a situation, he would definitely choose to commit suicide without hesitation. At that time, she did not want him to die too early, die too quickly, but the current situation of the Empire did not allow him to commit suicide. He could only commit suicide because the royal family still had to give a clear explanation and account to those neutral nobles. Sulu was no stranger to the dark and silent prison cell. He had once endured an entire half-year in such an environment where he would die in solitude. The Fox Fortress was once as intimate as his second home, but at that time he had the old thing playing asterisk, 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 asterisk. What could he have now? He could only constantly think, secretly experimenting, and gently stroking the metal bracelet on his left wrist. His life in the black prison did not last long. He welcomed the high-ranking judge of the Empire's judicial organization and the merciless executioner. After seriously listening to the Empire's sentence with a Tianjing accent, Su Lu finally understood that he would be executed in public at the entrance of the palace tomorrow. He furrowed his itchy brows, scratched his itchy hair, and rubbed his itchy instep. The electronic devices on his shoulder blades and the heavy shackles on his ankles clanged, making him feel a little uneasy. "Where is the dignity you promised?" He looked at the darkness outside the black prison and asked very seriously. "No torture, no death by 1,000 cuts, no humiliation, dying by a metal bullet. For a soldier, is this not dignity?" Huai Chaosher appeared at the entrance of the black prison and spoke coldly with her hands behind her back. "I don't understand why you have to do such an unnecessary trial. However, my Empire's words are correct. You seem to have said that I am Li Pifu's illegitimate son." Sulu stared at her, who was standing by the door. "For people of the Federation, isn't it an honor to die with such an identity?" "Of course not." Sulu shook his head and said, "I have a name, a father, a mother, a sister, a teacher, and friends. I don't have such a hobby." Huai Chaosher was silent for a moment before saying, "Before the execution, I will tell you about Ba Dao." After saying this, she silently turned around and prepared to leave with her hands behind her back. "It's a pity that I won't have the chance to hear the secret I want to know the most." Sula looked at her back and grinned. His white teeth were as bright as his eyes at this moment. Huai Chaosher's pupils constricted rapidly. Her body whistled through the air as she flew backwards. Her finger went straight for Su Li's chest. However, when the fingertip was still a few centimeters away from his chest, the smiling, small-eyed man suddenly spat out a mouthful of black blood and then fell straight down. "Yesterday, I went from Mudanjiang to Harbin. Then, I didn't have a ticket back to Daqing. In the end, I bought a soft sleeper." The train attendant laughed like crazy. "I'll find a day to talk about what I've been busy with these past few days." Chapter 604. If a person wanted to kill themselves, they could choose countless ways. The variety of choices far surpassed the Federation's protein meat. A straw rope, a fruit knife, or a golden chain were all enough to end a person's life. Even if one didn't have a straw rope, one could still pick up a rusty nail without a fruit knife, or a piece of metal without a golden chain. Moreover, this world was full of tall buildings, low buildings, deep pits, and shallow pits. The height and depth of the trees were enough to kill. Even if one's luck was so bad that they couldn't find anything at the moment of death, one would still have a tongue. Biting one's tongue to commit suicide might be too much of a grudge, but in the face of death, all methods were equal. Therefore, suicide was not a difficult matter. Hui Chaoshi was a dazzling red sun high up in the empire when she was young. After puberty, she hid her splendor and walked between the imperial palace and the military department. In recent years, she silently presided over the work of the Royal Intelligence Agency in secret. She had seen the surging waves and swallowed mountains and rivers, seen the filthy, vicious, and cruel darkness. As always, her heart was as strong as her body. For such a person, something as simple as suicide should not have caused her too much trouble. However, when she saw the scene of Su Lu vomiting black blood and falling straight to the ground, her valiant heart could not help but palpitate a little. Because the timing was wrong. After carefully studying all the information about Su Lu, Hui Chaoshi had never doubted that this person had the courage to kill her. However, why would he so resolutely choose to end her life before the last moment? You should still have many questions that need answers. Why are you willing to commit suicide? She looked at the Federation man, surrounded by medical personnel, and narrowed her eyes. Your Highness, the Imperial Medical Officer reported in a low voice, according to the results of the examination just now, his lung hematoma is very serious. His respiratory failure is severe. If he is needed alive, we must immediately send him to the ground for rescue. Then what are you hesitating for? Hui Chaoshi frowned at the medical officer and said, what is needed on the execution ground is a living Federation war hero, not a corpse. But the problem now is that even if we're lucky enough to save this person, he won't be able to stand up again. The medic wiped the sweat on his forehead. His medical team was equipped with enough examination equipment, so he knew very well how serious the injuries of this Federation captive were, and how strange they were. The nerve bundles in his body are perfectly fine, and there is no problem with the nerve hub under the double fiber bond. But for some reason, his nerve connection seems to have lost its function, like it has been broken. We cannot find the problem, so there is no way to fix it. What's the best outcome? Hui Chaoshi lowered her eyes and asked. Paralyzed, the medic replied in a low voice. Hui Chaoshi was silent for a moment, then walked to the bedside. The busy Imperial military doctors hurriedly made way for her. Hearing the beeping sounds of the instruments, she slowly put her hands behind her back. Looking at the dying Su Lu, her straight eyebrows slightly furrowed. Suddenly, her fingers shot out like lightning and forcefully tapped Su Li's chest. With a muffled thud, the severely unconscious Su Lu didn't react at all. You actually ignored my warning and tried to reconnect the broken meridians. You really aren't afraid of death. You really have guts. Hui Chaoshi retracted her fingers and lightly rubbed them, confirming that the medic's judgment was correct. This small-eyed man in front of her probably wouldn't stand up again in this lifetime. She thought of those continuous escapes and battles in the mulberry tree sea, but she didn't feel sentimental or sad because she never had the slightest bit of sympathy for her enemies. She only felt that it was a pity. There weren't many people in this universe who had the qualifications to fight side by side with her, and the only one who had ever fought side by side with her was Su Lu, who had vomited blood and fainted. The cooperation between the world's #1 mech fighter and the world's #1 mech mechanic was such a breathtaking and satisfying battle scene. From today onwards, there probably wouldn't be another. Send him to the 1st Imperial Hospital and transfer him to the Royal Special Forces to guard him. Hui Chaoshi closed her eyes and thought for a moment, then made a decision, try to save him. The first noble rebellion in the Empire in 100 years started from the shock and suspicion of the royal family. And this feeling also started from the strange death of County King Carlton. Now, this rebellion was about to disappear, but to completely eliminate the fear and suspicion of the huge noble class, especially the neutral noble class, the royal family really needed a living Su Lu, and then let him die for everyone to see. Many popular science and science books would mention near-death experiences, saying that at the moment of death, Human beings would look back at the past at the fastest speed, feel the present, and look forward. Sorry, there was no future here. Only a high-speed retreating hole condensed by a black wall. And on the other side of the hole was a pure white world, completely different from the bloodstains when human beings were born. Sulu had never believed in this saying. This semi-illiterate, who didn't finish the Federation's legal education, was filled with mechanical principles and a mechanical worldview. In his opinion, there was not much difference between human beings and the stray cats that ate leftover beef outside the mine, except for aesthetics. How could they have the privilege to reread their lives before they died? Then what would the near-death experience of the stray cats be like? Countless fat, big-eared rats? Even though the uncle had taught him the 10 postures, and the scorching, magical, trembling power was running through his body like countless fat rats, he still maintained an absolutely simple view of materialism. He sorrowfully and stubbornly believed that there was no heaven above his head, only the sky and the stars. Heaven could only be found in life. Sure enough, there was no black hole or holy white light, but there was a black dream, a very unoriginal black dream. However, the old charter computer didn't appear in the dream, wearing an old butler's uniform or really wearing a black silk skirt to talk about some mysterious things. In the black dream, there was only the painful tearing of the halo, the scattering of the breath, and no rebirth, gradually quieting down. Suicide was a very simple thing, and surviving was also a very simple thing, especially for a young man who had experienced countless life and death situations, and whose body muscles and organs were extremely strong. All he needed to do was to try hard to open his eyes. Sulu opened his eyes with difficulty, and the light in the gap of his eyelids gradually dimmed and became clear. There was a majestic oil painting on the wall, and the signature below, it was so messy that no one had any impulse to identify it. He's awake. Along with this surprise shout, there were dense and chaotic footsteps in the ward and the nervous voices of the treatment team. All kinds of advanced medical equipment were connected to his body. The metal contact should be very cold on his bare skin. Sulu, who had a very unpleasant past in the Federation Army General Hospital, thought silently in his heart, and then his body subconsciously prepared to tremble. However, he couldn't tremble. He didn't even feel a trace of coldness. Only now did he realize that his body was completely out of the control of his brain, and he couldn't feel anything. He furrowed his brows. Fortunately, he could still move his brows, so he should be able to close his eyes. Lying on the hospital bed, Sulu opened his mouth and smiled happily. This smile that came back from death instantly shocked the people of the Empire in the ward and made them collectively speechless. A few days later, I warned you, your Jinshi has already been scattered by me, and the meridians in the upper circulation have been blocked. If you try to force a breakthrough, only death will await you. Huai Chaoshi stood by the bed with her hands behind her back. She looked at Sulu on the bed, looked at his extremely thin cheeks, and said expressionlessly, I really didn't expect that you would actually use this as a means of suicide. Sulu smiled and didn't say anything. Now his entire body was paralyzed, and he could only move above his neck. Other than speaking, he could only use his expression to express his thoughts. He could no longer imitate President Pabre and forcefully wave his right arm to help his emotions rise. A human's expression could only choose between laughing and crying, joy and sadness, happiness and depression, calmness and depression, and these two opposite camps. So, Sulu naturally chose the former. According to the judgment of the doctor and me, you will never be able to stand up again in this life. Huai Chaoshi looked at him and said indifferently, How does it feel to be paralyzed? You can no longer carry the prosthetic arm to display your talent. Do you regret it? Why do I feel like your highness has more regrets than me? Sulu, with his thin cheeks, finally opened his mouth to speak. His voice was extremely hoarse and weak. He said, The feeling of being paralyzed, and is a bit fresh. From a file, I can't judge that you are a hopeless optimist. Huai Chaoshi turned around, poured herself a cup of coffee, and said casually, That's because I have never fallen into hopeless despair, so I can't display my talent in this area. Huai Chaoshi turned around with the coffee cup in her hand. After a moment of silence, she suddenly asked, "If you had died that day, and now you are paralyzed, would you really be willing?" Hearing this, Sulu was silent for a long time. He stared straight at the snow-white ceiling until the corners of his mouth lifted into a trace of a complicated and indescribable smile. Only then did he reply in a low and hoarse voice, "Of course I wouldn't be willing. I still have a lot of things I haven't done, a lot of secrets I don't know." For example, Huai Chaoshi took a sip of coffee. "You have seen my file, so you should know about Zhang Xiaoming. Your first love." "That's right." Su Li's eyes narrowed. He sighed softly and said, "I used to always want to make love with her one more time before I die. Now it seems that I don't have a chance. This is probably the biggest unwillingness." Hearing this unexpected answer, Huai Chaoshi was moved. She asked, "Why not your national girl Jin Shuier?" Of course, in my opinion, among those ambiguous women in the Federation, only that female engineer nutshell is worth dating. Without waiting for Su Li's reply, this imperial princess, who had never been in a relationship before, thought that she understood something. She shook her head and said, "Stupid first love complex." Su Li smiled and didn't explain. In the entire universe, probably only the prince of the Tai family knew the real reason for this kind of unwillingness. "Since you are unwilling, why do you want to commit suicide? Since you are a hopeless optimist, I always thought that you would persist until the end, at least until the execution. The Federation's proverb says that if the Grim Reaper tells you to report at 3 o'clock, you will never see the first ray of sunlight again. But I'm a soldier. Even if I'm facing the Grim Reaper, I have to compete with him in terms of strength." After a moment of silence, Su Li replied, "You want me to go to the execution ground and let a lot of people watch me die. I don't know the specific reason, but if you want something, I will make sure that you don't get it. At least I can choose the method of death and the time of death. Until the moment of death, soldiers should fight. Suicide is actually a kind of battle." Chapter 605. The three sentences were like three hard stones that jumped out of the air, smashed into the ground, and then bounced up. Even if they eventually shattered, they refused to be deformed in the slightest. Their valiance and stubbornness were hard to describe. Huai Chaoshi was silent for a moment. She, who was confident and arrogant under her ordinary face, did not care about the impassioned Su Lu on the sickbed at all. However, when she heard the three stiff sentences, she could not help but feel a sense of vigilance. If the soldiers of the Federation were all tough people like this, the war that was about to come might not be easy to fight. "I promised you that I would let you die with dignity." She put down the coffee cup in her hand, looked at his unusually thin face, and said slowly, "Since you believe that this way of dying is not dignified and have decided on another way yourself, I can only accept it. If a completely paralyzed captive cannot provide the corresponding benefits for the Empire will naturally not keep you for nothing. I can't say that I look forward to the arrival of that day, because there is no one who is not afraid of death. However, since that day is bound to come, there's actually not much meaning to what you're saying." Far away from his home galaxy, alone in the depths of the Empire's enemy territory, Sulu, whose life and death were unpredictable or perhaps destined to die, seemed to have found some of the shadow of the orphan on the clock tower street back then in his last moments. He raised his eyebrows, looked at Huai Chaoshi with a rather playful smile, and said, "However, it seems that you have won that bet. The bet between you and me was not fair from the beginning." Huai Chaoshi replied. Then she took out a small booklet and asked, "This is what we found on you when we captured you. Can you explain it?" Sula glanced at the old booklet, and his thoughts instantly returned to the planet full of ice and snow before the new year like a movie. After being captured and brought to the Empire's Tianjing planet, he had never seen the sky above the enemy's headquarters. He had only seen the endless darkness and the snow-white ceiling of the ward. The people around him were all enemies, and the air was filled with the smell of a foreign land. He missed the past more than any other moment in his life. The subordinates of the 7th Division, the small team of the Nutshell Engineering Department, the mecha group that silently advanced in the snow. He even missed the monster Iron 7th Division trained by Du Shaoqing, the Highland Valley at 3,320 meters, the Glacier Forest at 5,460 meters, the road lost in the snow, and the deep pits beside the road, the corpses of countless Federation civilians in the pits, the diary of an Empire officer, and the gray eyes of a little Federation girl that couldn't close. I believe you have already read this booklet. Su Lu replied. This officer named Arthur was executed by your own people because he was unwilling to carry out the Expeditionary Army's order to kill. I have to say, he's the first person from Empire that I wouldn't describe as a beast. Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes, and the coldness gradually grew, but she didn't say anything. Su Lu didn't seem to feel that pair of cold eyes at all. He continued to frown and said, You asked me earlier about my unwillingness. In fact, I really do have a lot of unwillingness. He calmly looked into Huai Caoshi's eyes and said, You are the butchers of the universe. It's a great regret that I can't completely destroy you. Huai Caoshi was silent for a moment, then shook her head and said with slight mockery, I thought that after taking you to Li Ban to read our textbooks, you would have a relatively objective and clear understanding of history. I didn't expect you to still be a piece of trash that was brainwashed by the Federation. Don't you think it's a bit ridiculous for the Empire's princess to say the words brainwashing to a Federation citizen? Or do you think that the role of the Imperial Expeditionary Force's Royal Supervision Group is only to direct the chorus? Su Lu refuted without any trace of politeness. This is war. Huai Caoshi coldly said, There has never been a just war in the history of the universe, especially when this war is between the Empire and the Federation. You have even less of a moral chip to take out. War is naturally only war. George Carlin has said this many times. Su Lu stared into her eyes and said, But war is definitely not about slaughtering civilians. Your Federation's army isn't all a model of morality like you. The mockery on Huai Caoshi's lips grew even stronger. If you flip through the history of the Empire's resistance against invasion, you can find countless examples that show that your comrades are actually no different from wild beasts. Su Lu was silent for a very long time. Then he slowly replied, What's wrong is wrong. This has nothing to do with who's wrong or which camp they belong to. If you encountered this kind of situation in the army, how would you deal with it? Huai Caoshi looked at him like she was looking at an idiot. I don't know. Su Lu replied very honestly. But don't misunderstand. I'm playing the role of a moral pretentious prick right now. I've always lived according to my habits. Whether it was assassinating Macklin or fighting you on the front lines of the Westwoods, I simply thought that these things should be done. So I did it. Prince Macklin is the most outstanding member of the royal family in the history of the Empire, and he's also my uncle, Huai Caoshi said calmly. Thank you, Su Lu said very seriously. With these two simple sentences, he understood the true identity of the seed of the Empire who had died under his pen. He also understood that for him to have killed Macklin with his own hands to have a relatively dignified death, this princess by his bedside must have put in a lot of effort. Huai Caoshi gently placed the diary of the Empire's military officer on the table, then looked at the old diary cover in silence for a long time. Perhaps she was imagining everything that had happened in the Westwoods that year in her mind. The temperature in the ward is not bad. She woke up from her thoughts and looked at the beads of sweat on Su Li's forehead. She said calmly, Do you feel very hot? At this moment, beads of sweat the size of soybeans were continuously pouring out from the roots of Su Li's hair and then dripping down from the corners of his eyebrows, instantly wetting the entire pillow. His thin cheeks were abnormally pale, and his tightly pursed thin lips were trembling nonstop, but the smile in his eyes was still so natural. Not hot. Su Li's voice became more and more hoarse. Huai Caoshi finally could not help but frown and shake her head. She said, Why hold it in? After saying this, she turned and left the ward. Just as the ward door closed, Su Li's spirit suddenly relaxed. Although his paralyzed body could not show anything, the sweat pouring out of his thick black hair suddenly increased. His brows were tightly furrowed, and there was no longer any smile on his face. His lips were painfully pulled open, revealing a mouth full of white teeth. Blood continuously seeped out of his gums, making him look extremely wretched. Ever since he woke up from his near-death coma, he had been enduring immense pain. His body could not move, but his internal senses had become even more sensitive. The collapsed power channel had become countless sharp fragments, wantonly cutting in all directions. His nervous system had been severely damaged, but he could very sadly clearly feel the pain of these small knives cutting into his flesh. There was also the mysterious burning power that had finally broken through the barrier. Although it was no longer suppressed by the power of Huai Caoshi's finger, it could no longer be controlled. It ran up and down his body chaotically, turning into thousands of tiny scalding whips that lashed at every cell in his body, making him feel even the tiniest sensation. It was not a death by dismemberment, but it was even worse than that. Su Li's pain was unbearable. Even if he gritted his teeth until they were broken, he could not hold on for much longer. If Huai Caoshi had not left just now, he might not have been able to hold on any longer. In order to die with dignity, one must first ensure one's own dignity. He insisted on this, so he smiled and mocked the conversation, refusing to let the muscles on his cheeks twitch because of the endless pain. Sweat flowed down his body like a river, wetting his pillow and bedding for an entire night. It was only when the unfamiliar morning light of Tianjing seeped in through the window that he, whose face was extremely pale and weak, realized that he had been fighting that kind of pain for an entire night. How many people in this world could endure this kind of pain? To be able to endure something that ordinary people could not, they were naturally not ordinary people. This kind of person would most likely achieve great things in the end, as long as they did not die in an accident in their career. This was because they had too strong of a willpower and will that supported them to fight to the death against something that they could not endure. Su Li could endure it because he was unwilling. He had not worn his general's uniform and returned to the dark and boring Donglin mining area to take a look at the cafe, the pub, the library, the big recuperation center, the long-legged policewoman, and the police officer called Bao Longtao. He had not seen the men and women on S1 complete their stories. Tai Ziwan had not gotten married. How was Miss Bai going to wrap things up? Would Zhou Yu carry little Lu Hua and stand under that building to wait for someone to return home? He had not personally caressed Jian Shuayer's black hair. He had not once again used Shang Qiu's greatness to warm his lonely right hand. He had not yet returned the kindness of that beautiful girl. He had not yet found out the truth behind that uncle's death. He had not yet driven the turbocharged MXD to the road in the middle of Lin Mountain to have a crazy race with that bunch of idiotic sons of the senators. He had not yet concealed his identity and gone to some crazy place to dance and have fun. He had not yet forced by Magnolia to cut off that annoying strand of hair that floated in front of his forehead. He had not yet brought Xiong Lin Quan to carry to Lin's gun to help the Wincy snatch his sister from the 13th floor. He had not yet gotten sick of singing that song with Shi Qinghai. He had not yet had the time to tell everyone that he was Su Lu, the orphan of Donglin Su Lu, and not the soldier Su Lu. How could he be willing to die? Suicide was a battle, but it was also a new gamble. In a situation where he had nothing to lose, he could only gamble with his own life on this last gamble. With difficulty, he turned his head to look at the first ray of morning light from the willow tree outside the window. Su Lu breathed rapidly and tiredly. An abnormal blush appeared on his pale face. In the Empire, this ray of morning light should be called the white belly of a fish. Only a dead fish would show its ugly white belly to fishermen or tourists. He was not dead yet. This was good. Chapter 606. The maple trees outside the window were moving, and the wind was blowing through the treetops. The morning light shone in through the window and onto the hospital bed. The nervous system in his body was fine, but the complicated and elusive energy channels that flowed around the nerves were broken. The injury, which was indescribable, had successfully interfered with the transmission of information from the nerves. As a result, there was an additional paralyzed and weak patient on the hospital bed. The ants that rose in the morning under the old trees, the birds that sang in the breeze, the cracks in the sturdy building walls, and the people who were watching from behind the walls. Everything on Tianjing planet seemed to be moving, except for the frail and weak body on the hospital bed. Fortunately, his heart could move. As long as his heart could move, it was fine. As the thoughts in the deepest part of his mind revolved, the paralyzed body on the hospital bed seemed to move in a space that was connected to reality, yet was completely separated from it. Raising his knees, extending his arms, twisting his waist, lowering his hips, bending his elbows. The 10 strange postures that were imprinted in his mind were slowly displayed one by one. The familiar burning and trembling sensation finally appeared once again. Although it only appeared in his mind, it still made him feel extremely relieved. The barrier that Huai Chaoshi had struck into his body with a strange method was shattered because he had gambled with his life. The burning power that had been blocked for many days was like a flood that had suddenly been freed. It fiercely surged out, smashing the dam and scattering to every corner of his body without any sense of direction. Then it transformed into sharp knives and thin whips that whipped and cut his sensitive areas, bringing him endless pain. However, at this moment, following the postures in his mind, the speed at which the flood spread around his body seemed to have slowed down a little. The sharp knives that were cutting everywhere seemed to have become a little blunt, and the thin whips that were whipping randomly seemed to have become a little shorter by an inch. Although this change was extremely subtle, it was extremely clear to Sulu, who had to constantly resist the unbearable pain. He didn't know how all of this had happened, but he knew that changes were ultimately good things. However, it seemed that the scattered fragments of power had some kind of innate resistance to this kind of request. Every time he tried to pull back the fragments of power that were far away from the fixed channel, his spirit would be greatly depleted. Moreover, it was like holding a sharp blade with one's bare hands. It was so painful that it was dripping with blood, incessantly and vividly, to the extent that it was unbearable. Sulu, who was lying on the hospital bed, was well aware of this principle. He closed his eyes tightly and cautiously experienced this feeling. He valiantly and resolutely endured the more and more terrible pain. This pain made his pair of dark eyebrows deeply furrow, like an idiot thinking about a philosophical problem. Beads of sweat the size of soybeans converged into a river and flowed down, instantly drenching the clothes and sheets. After an unknown amount of time, Sula finally opened his eyes. His eyes, which were usually sincere, amiable, and bright when he was in the Federation, were now filled with endless exhaustion. There was even a trace of fear and regret that was rarely seen in him. This kind of pain was too terrible. It wasn't like using a bare hand to hold a sharp blade. To be more precise, it was like a newborn baby's delicate hand holding a sharp blade that had been burned red. Every time his mind came into contact with the scattered power in his body, it would produce a similar feeling. During this process, how many times had he come into contact with this kind of thing? Again, how many people in the world could endure this kind of pain? He was the most persevering Donglin stone of the younger generation. However, under this round of increasingly painful torture, the moss on the stone's surface had already peeled off, and cracks had already appeared on the stone surface. It was about to collapse and scatter. Under the influence of his will, the scattered burning fragments in his weak body gradually slowed down the speed at which they spread. It was like the universe in the later stages of the Big Bang, suddenly ushering in a long period of peace. However, this kind of change was, after all, a minute. Sula didn't know how many more times he had to endure this kind of pain before he could achieve his goal. He didn't even know why he was doing this. Why was his will able to gather the scattered power? Or was this just his own hallucination under the pain? As an engineer officer who had received a materialistic education from a young age and whose dream was to become a mechanic officer, this was indeed a very big problem. During Sang Shuhai's escape, Huai Chaoshi, in order to ensure that this Federation mechanic genius could maintain his ability to move and keep up with their pace and pace, had once seriously warned him not to attempt to break through the Jinchi restriction she had planted in his fingertips. Reality proved that this warning was true. However, Sulu had no other choice. The next day, he was to be executed in front of the royal palace. He had to take this risk. If he didn't succeed, he would become a ghost. At the very least, he would become a ghost with dignity, a combat ghost who made it difficult for the Empire's people's political ideas to be realized. If he succeeded, once he recovered the mysterious power in his body, then he would have a much better chance of escaping the Empire's control. He had no choice but to throw himself into this gamble, and he had to throw himself into it completely. Unfortunately, the result of a suicide attempt to break through the Jinchi restriction couldn't be said to be success or failure. He didn't die, but he also couldn't recover his strength. His entire body lay paralyzed on the bed, but he still didn't despair. Feng Yu had once taught him that the human body was a machine of the first order. He didn't know what ate rice was, what Jinchi was, and he didn't know that the Empire's royal family had meridians. However, he could describe the channels of the burning power in his body with his eyes closed. He could describe the flow of power with extremely precise numerical differences. He could accurately draw countless three-dimensional structural diagrams in his mind, just like how he deconstructed the MX mecha. Perhaps the three major systems of the human body were more complicated and even difficult to understand compared to metal such as mecha and battleships. However, he was Sulu, a mechanic genius that even Feng Yu secretly sighed with emotion. Just like repairing a mecha, he began to repair his own body. However, repairing the arm became a thought in his mind. In the past, probably no one had ever thought of such a solution to the problem. Li Pifa didn't, Feng Yu didn't, the strong people of the Empire didn't, no one. Because they weren't Sulu, they weren't the guy who had lived with a mechanical arm since childhood and dealt with machines all his life. There are many body cultivation halls in Philadelphia. Did body cultivation halls mean to repair the body? However, it seemed that he had never heard of a body cultivation hall cultivating someone like him. Even Mr. Tion only had amazing skills and strength. Sula looked at the snow-white ceiling and thought silently. Huai Chaoshi hadn't been here for many days. As the imperial princess and the highest-ranking officer of the Royal Intelligence Agency, she definitely had to deal with countless affairs, especially when the rebellion of the nobles had not been completely quelled. Several imperial doctors were quietly analyzing the state of his body beside the bed. The pain in his body was still constantly invading and destroying his will. If he didn't force himself to remember the past, he was really worried that he would faint from the pain. Other than recalling the past and secretly repairing his body, he spent most of his time thinking. He thought about the Federation Constitution, the computer problem, and his own problems. After all, the more he thought about it, the more confused and inconceivable he became. According to his personality, he usually didn't want to spend too much time thinking about things that he couldn't understand. However, he was paralyzed in bed right now. There was too much time and too much pain, so he didn't want to spend his days without thinking. The Imperial medical team didn't notice the subtle changes in his body. They only found that this captive of the Federation often had problems with the electrolyte balance. If they didn't save him in time, there were many times when he almost died due to excessive dehydration and circulation problems in his body. During these dozens of days, there were often nobles of the Empire who came to visit. Occasionally, there would also be people from the Imperial Military Department who came to torture some information. Fortunately, because of Huai Caoshi's promise, he didn't suffer much. In fact, compared to the endless pain in his body, he didn't mind drinking some spicy water to distract himself. Other than that, no one in the hospital dared to talk to him on the bed, including the two female nurses from the Empire who had lush hair but were still beautiful. Only the snow-white ceiling and the pungent smell of antiseptic accompanied him. The maple trees outside the window were red, but Sulu couldn't see them. He could only infer this result from the faint light reflected from the snow-white ceiling. He didn't know how long he had stayed in this hospital. At the beginning, he still had the mood to count the days and take deep breaths to welcome the morning light every day. However, the repeated pain made him numb, and the overlapping loneliness made him depressed. The counting of days didn't last long. Sulla knew very well that this kind of daze wouldn't last long. Once the Empire confirmed that he couldn't be squeezed out anything from him and couldn't stand up again as a target to explain to the nobles, he would naturally be killed. No matter how rich the nobles of the Empire were, they wouldn't raise a useless captive of the enemy. On a very ordinary day, the door of the ward was opened. A team of fully armed elite soldiers of the Empire walked in and took control of the entire ward in silence. Was it time? Sulla watched this scene with narrowed eyes. He took a deep breath and waited calmly and weakly. His right index finger, covered by the bedsheet, trembled slightly. At this moment, several nobles of the Empire in luxurious clothes walked in. One of them was about 40 years old. He looked at him on the bed expressionlessly and said, "Although a disabled person shouldn't be able to grasp the relevant etiquette, I still hope that you can learn something. Otherwise, you'll definitely know that being paralyzed is not the most painful thing in the world." The Federation language this person spoke was extremely awkward. Sulla replied hoarsely, "I can understand the Empire language." "Very good." The official raised his eyebrows in surprise and said, "You should be mentally prepared. His Majesty wants to see you." Hearing this, Sulla was extremely surprised. Why did the Emperor want to see him? But he immediately calmed himself down. After a moment of silence, he said with difficulty, "I don't think this is an honor." This was not an honor, but an opportunity. The index finger under the bedsheet slowly relaxed and then became motionless. Chapter 607. It was around autumn. Red and yellow leaves covered the streets and alleys of Tianjing Planet. For light green jet cylinders flew past the treetops at a low altitude, like the tip of a pen brushing past the bright colors. Then, they landed at an airport outside the center of the capital city. The group changed to military vehicles and headed toward the center of the city along the spacious high-grade roads that extended in all directions like a spider web. They arrived at their destination in the afternoon. The majestic and cold side door of the palace slowly opened, and a group of guards wearing royal military uniforms walked out. They silently took a moving, self-restraining bed from the fleet and headed into the depths of the palace. The white restraints were like spider silk, tightly binding the thin, weak, and paralyzed young foreigner on the moving bed, making him look like an insect that was about to be sucked to death. Along the way, the Empire's people didn't use equipment to control Sulla's vision and hearing. He was finally able to take a look at this city that only existed in the imagination of the Federation people, the Empire's capital city of Tianjing Planet. The vast maple forest on the outskirts of the city, the extraordinarily wide highways, and the unique architecture all brought him a great shock. It must be known that although the Federation had paid a great price to obtain an image of this huge city, very few people were able to see it with their own eyes. However, all the Federation people who had seen the capital city of Tianjing Planet should be dead, right? Sulla was very clear that no matter what the Emperor's intentions were for summoning him, death was already very close to his body. Being able to see the Empire's capital city before his death and feel the atmosphere that the Federation people would rarely experience in their entire lives, according to his inherent nature, his eyes should emit a greedy and emotional glow. However, there was only calmness in this pair of small eyes today. Even though his heart was shaken when he saw this majestic palace that was known as the most magnificent human building in the universe, he controlled his facial expression extremely well. The Empire's soldiers who were pushing the bed into the depths of the palace noticed the calmness of this Federation captive and couldn't help but have a strange feeling. Sulla narrowed his eyes and looked at the huge, cylindrical alloy building that pierced through the clouds in the distance. He guessed that it was probably the palace where the Emperor lived in the rumors. He was shocked again, but the expression on his face became colder and colder. How many truly important moments in a person's life could there be? Marriage, childbirth, funeral. Today, he, a soldier of the Federation, was going to meet the Federation's greatest enemy, the warmongering, arrogant, and cruel Emperor of the Empire. If he didn't pretend now, when would he? At this moment, He missed the wide sunglasses that Zhou had given him. He felt that he should be Du Shaoqing, riding the maglev elevator that had long been forced to eliminate by the Federation's Energy Management Committee because of its huge energy consumption. It did not take long for them to reach the sky from the ground of the palace that was full of flowers, trees, and surveillance equipment. It was really the heavens. The sun in the distance moved slowly toward the horizon. The clouds just had a hint of sunset aura. Golden light rose, red, and people seemed to be floating outside the building. It gave people a feeling that they were within reach. Those who lived here day and night, no matter how firm and steady their minds were, would still be moved higher and higher by the distance from the ground and the drifting clouds around them. They would become more and more indifferent. They would become more and more used to looking down on the common people and take it as a lifelong pleasure. With a hint of criticism, the tightly bound Su Lu turned his neck with difficulty and retracted his gaze from the clouds outside the palace. He narrowed his eyes and looked into the darkness in front of him, looking at the back figure in the depths of the darkness. That figure belonged to a middle-aged man. He wore a robe and sat on a soft couch. He held a golden sword in his hand and did not look back. A screen blocked in front of the soft couch. There were golden sunflowers painted on it. At this time, the sunset outside, the building reflected the golden light, making the screen seem like it was going to burn. The sunflowers seemed like they were going to come alive. However, all of the dim light fell on the middle-aged man's back and became dim. It was because he was the emperor of the empire, the man with the greatest power in the universe. No one in the Federation had ever seen the emperor's true appearance. They only knew that he was called Huai Fuchai, the 79th emperor of the empire's White Hibiscus dynasty, the unmatched monarch of the entire left Sky Star region. In reality, not even the empire's ordinary nobles and commoners knew what their emperor looked like. Ever since he ascended the throne, he had never appeared in any of the empire's media, nor were there any images leaked out. The Federation's research concluded that this emperor was deliberately maintaining a sense of mystery in front of his subjects. This was to facilitate the protection of the imperial family's shaky rule. In many relatively strange discussions, people even called this emperor and the intelligence chief of the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army as the two most mysterious people in the universe. Sulu did not believe this. In his opinion, that uncle with a mouthful of rotten teeth was the one who truly deserved the word mysterious. But as a soldier of the Federation, to be able to see the emperor of the empire with his own eyes and come into contact with him at such a close distance, how could he not be excited? As the screen of golden sunflowers grew closer and closer, that robed figure grew clearer and clearer. Sulu grew more and more nervous. Ever since he fled Donglin, he had seen many powerful figures with extraordinary auras. He was also a frequent guest at the presidential residence's private banquets. However, for some reason, he always felt that the emperor under that robe gave him a particularly strong sense of oppression. Was it the smell of power or the smell of death? Was it the identity of the emperor or this person himself? Sulu could not tell clearly, but he could be sure that in his entire life, it was probably only when he first saw the war, godly Pifu, in Qingqing's military prison that his mind would be shaken like this. Behind the screen stood Huai Chaoshi. In front of the soft couch, there was a white-haired aristocrat of the empire. He was half-bowing and softly saying something. The emperor, under the robe, slowly raised his right arm. This simple movement was enough to stop the millions of soldiers at the same time. The faint mist outside the palace seemed to have paused for a moment. The aristocrat's narration came to an abrupt end. The emperor's voice was a bit low, like a thick book being blown by the wind. "Did you kill Prince Delin?" "Yes." Sulu did not look a Huai Chaoshi behind the screen. Narrowing his eyes, he stared at the back of the emperor and answered calmly, as if he was answering a small question in a cooking program. "Did you activate the charter on 3320? "Yes." "Did you kill Prince Carlton?" "Yes." The emperor did not turn his head. His eyes should have fallen on that old aristocrat. He let out a few strange laughs. "What's the relationship between you and Nasri?" "Never heard of him." "Well, I heard that his last name was Fonyu over there." The emperor slowly turned around. His face was cold and graceful. Hearing the last question, Su Li's pupils suddenly shrank. He felt that the band around his neck suddenly tightened, making it difficult for him to breathe. Chapter 608. Sulu had always thought that other than the few people in the Lees of Philadelphia, no one in this world knew about the relationship between him and Fengyu. Who would have thought that in the Empire, countless light years away from his homeland, the Emperor in front of him could reveal so many secrets with just one sentence? Huai Chao Shi, who was standing beside the golden sunflower screen, and the white-haired aristocrat in front of the soft couch had a bigger reaction than him. After hearing the name Nasri, Huai Chao Shi, who had always been calm, raised her head in shock. The aristocrat's eyebrows were raised extremely high, and then quickly fell. The empire's military minister, Prince Barou, was the emperor's brother. The disputes between the royal family and Master Fan's manor were not secrets to him. He knew very well what the name Nasri meant to the emperor. While he was shocked by the relationship between this Federation soldier and Nasri, he also thought sadly that since the emperor let him hear these things, he had probably already made a decision in his heart. Emperor Huai Fuchai slowly stood up, his long robe pouring down like flowing clouds. He ignored the shock of the three people in the room and looked at Prince Barou expressionlessly. I originally didn't need to explain Keaton's death to you, but I didn't think that you would be so stupid. You all always said that no one in this world could kill Keaton under such circumstances, so his death must be my scheme, Huai Caoshi's decision. But now, Nasri's descendant has personally admitted that he killed Keaton. Do you have any new doubts? Prince Barou was silent for a long time. Finally, he no longer humbly bent his body and slowly stood up straight. His back was as straight as a pine tree. He looked at Huai Fuchai and said calmly, "Actually, I really don't need to explain. You should know very well that I have always been afraid of you. Keaton's death made my fear into rare courage. But I really didn't think that Nasri was actually still alive and actually had a son. There are many things in this world that people can't imagine," Huai Fuchai replied coldly. Prince Barou smiled bitterly and said, "In the end, you just want to convince me. You can rebel against me and try to overthrow my rule. In fact, ever since Father chose me as the crown prince, you have been doing this for decades." Huai Fuchai put his hands behind his back, his gaze distant as he gazed at the distant clouds. He said slowly, "But I find it very difficult to accept that you would act because of such a stupid reason. I am even more unwilling to bear moral responsibility for something I have never done." Prince Borowski didn't answer anything. He silently tidied up his clothes and then walked to the railing. At the end of the railing, several soldiers were waiting to arrest the mastermind behind the nobles' rebellion. Prince Bo Wu smiled and touched the railing with his wrinkled hand. Then, he shook his head and fell down into the sunset. Huai Fuchai coldly looked at this scene. Seeing his own brother commit suicide by jumping off a building, his expression didn't change at all. Only his eyes that seemed to be able to see through the clouds looked down, as if he was chasing after the figure in the air. The tightly bound Su Lu silently watched all of this. He knew that he had personally witnessed a page of the history of the Empire. He didn't know what the truth of this noble's rebellion was, what kind of dangerous assassination the Emperor encountered, what kind of valiant suppression of the rebellion, who that old noble was, but he could guess that with the death of that noble, this rebellion finally came to an end. The Emperor probably tied him up and brought him into the palace to make these rebellious nobles believe that he had nothing to do with Keaton's death. Su Lu pondered in silence, but he was startled by the burning gaze of the two people. He thought that question again. From that sentence, it was obvious that the Emperor knew the uncle. Could it be that the uncle was really a traitor? He looked up at the middle-aged man in front of him, narrowed his eyes, and asked hoarsely, "Can I know who Nasri is?" The Emperor didn't answer his question. Instead, he looked at his face with a complicated expression and asked, "Where is he now?" "He's already dead," Su Lu replied. The Emperor was silent for a long time. He waved his sleeve as if to drive away an extremely unpleasant memory and a green fly. He said, This kind of person should have died long ago. How do you know my relationship with him? Su Lu suddenly thought of a very fatal problem. If the imperial family knew Feng Yu's ability very well and knew that he had the means to take out the chip behind his neck, then how could they not guard against his escape? Li Pifu, this kind of person, will not have an illegitimate child. Huai Fuchai said indifferently. And you're also a person of the Federation who knows ate rice, so you are naturally Nasri's son. Thinking of the conversation between the emperor and the nobleman, Su Lu felt more and more strange. Why did the people of the empire insist that he was Feng Yu's son and not a student? Could it be that, as Huai Chaosher had once said, this strange thing called eight Raishinchi was really a boring existence of blood theory? This is a very simple inference. What is very interesting is that in the entire universe, there are probably only a few people who can infer it. Huai Fuchai's face was cold and did not appear to be interested. Now my question is, since he is dead, who should I vent the anger that has been accumulating for more than 20 years? A wind came from outside the building, not fierce, not gentle, just cold. Such was the atmosphere of the scene. Standing by the screen, Huai Chaosher, who had been silent all this time, suddenly raised his head and looked at his father. It seemed that he wanted to say something, but in the end his lips were tightly pressed together, and he did not say a word. I don't know what happened back then. Su Lu did not explain to the other the true relationship between himself and Feng Yu. He looked at the emperor and narrowed his eyes. As for what you think, it does not have much to do with me. Right now, I'm only one of your captives. Huai Fuchai held his hands behind his back and stood silently for a long time, as if he did not hear what he was saying. Then he slowly lowered his body and picked up the old rattan at his feet. The rattan was held tightly, and there were faint traces of old black blood on it. The rattan fell heavily. It did not dance like a flower, but viciously split open the air and then tore at the bandages and restraints on Su Li's body. It tore at his flesh, carrying endless resentment and anger, venting the hatred of a monarch that came from who knew where. Pa! 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 There were countless small metal hooks hidden in the rattan. Each swing was like the terrifying kiss of a tiger's tongue, scraping off a thin layer of flesh, causing extreme pain. Huai Fuchai silently and forcefully swung the rattan like a calm madman, whipping the completely paralyzed young man. The sound of wind breaking and the sound of cloth being rolled up mixed together in the palace. Su Li's face was abnormally pale, his eyes abnormally bright. Paralyzed, he should not have felt pain, but this kind of humiliating torture seemed to hurt his heart. The wind whistled past, and a miserable wound appeared on his chin. He did not close his eyes. His bright eyes were round with anger as he stared at the crazy monarch in front of him. He spat out blood and roared, "I'll fuck your mother," missing 6 chapters and 2,000 words. Because his father was also reading, he originally did not want to explain, but thinking of the resentment of the people, he had to explain. At night, when I was picking up the leader from work, there was a traffic accident. I was fine, but the 3-wheeled motorcycle was not. I was tossed around in the hospital and the traffic police for too long, and only returned home late at night. Chapter 609. People who were humiliated, tortured, and hurt would occasionally cry out in despair. Pain would make people sob, make people toss and turn, make people bite the corners of their quilts, break out in cold sweat, and lean against the corners of their chairs with yellow faces. Sometimes, it would also make people unable to help themselves from cursing out vulgarities that they would never have cursed under normal circumstances. The merciless and humiliating whipping of the thorns, the bloody marks on his chin, and the flying red bandages stimulated Su Li's heart. Therefore, he angrily shouted out a profanity about the emperor's mother. F***ck your mother. In the vast universe, who dared to say such words to the emperor of the empire? Not being afraid of death was far from enough. That person had to clearly understand that they were going to die. Coincidentally, Su Lu met these 2 conditions. Therefore, he wantonly said those words, pleasing his cold and angry heart and balancing the fear before death. The 4 words that the paralyzed and weak person seemed to have used up all of his strength and energy to burst out were like a clap of thunder, instantly spreading throughout the entire palace. The servants of the empire in the distance looked up in shock. The golden sunflower on the screen nearby turned around and pretended not to hear it. Huai Chaoshu opened her eyes wide and looked at the pale-faced person under the flying thorns in disbelief. She stared at the bloody foam in the air. These words must have clearly reached the ears of the emperor, but his expression did not change in the slightest. The hint of madness in his indifferent and graceful appearance continued, and the thorns in his hand continued to fall down one after another, landing on Su Li's body, venting his many years of frustration. The emperor stared at Su Li, who was tightly bound, but the gaze in his eyes seemed to pass through his face to the face from countless years ago, the 2 faces. The thorns in his hand swung down slowly and steadily in a gentle but heart-palpitating rhythm, breaking through flesh, splashing blood, and bringing pain. That person was already dead, and the resentment of the past could no longer find a target for revenge. Just like the rosy clouds in the sky, the bright moon in the water, and the sunflower in the mirror, how could they be satisfied without any real feedback? As a result, he placed all of the resentment that no one knew about on the thorns, landing on the body of this Federation youth in front of him, turning them into blood that splattered everywhere. Because you were his descendant. The vines fell directly, as if to whip some kind of cowardice in the heart. The Emperor Huai, Fu Chai's expression was indifferent, the madness in his eyes gradually receding, becoming increasingly cold. F***CK your mother. Sulu also widened his eyes and stared at the Emperor of the Imperium who was right in front of him. Every time his body was hit by a thorn, his grayish-white thin lips would open and repeat the same profanity. Compared to the first time, his voice was much weaker, but it was still clear enough for the Emperor in front of him and Huai Chaoshu beside him to hear it clearly. With a bang, the ratchet fell down. Fuck your mother. With another bang, the ratchet fell down again. Fuck your mother again. As many as the ratchet fell down, I'll fuck your mother again. F***CK is a kind of attitude towards life. This is a kind of attitude of not lowering one's head, not blinking, not narrowing one's eyes, only staring at you, unyielding, unavoiding, and fearless. Even if you're the most powerful person in the universe, even if you can make millions of people shed blood into rivers with a single word, you still can't not let me F***CK you. You can use a red iron needle to sew my mouth shut, but I can use my finger to write a large F***CK character. You can cut off all of my 10 fingers, but I can still silently chant the bright F***CK character in my heart. Of course, you can kill me, but since death is already here, why not F***CK me a few more times before death? The Emperor didn't have anyone seal his mouth, only lowering his head slightly, as if he was carrying out some kind of ritual, slowly and forcefully whipping his body. Sulu also lowered his head slightly, staring straight at his face, as if returning some kind of courtesy, slowly, softly, and forcefully uttering a curse. Pa F***CK your mother. At the time, the situation in the royal palace was like this. The great emperor and the brave Federation hero, because of the unique part of each other's temperament, became two seemingly expressionless but, in reality, unusually crazy fighting cocks with black and red coxcombs raised their necks and looked with disdain at the world and the other side, carrying out a childlike confrontation with each other using one curse word after another. The trembling imperial servants and female officials kneeling outside the palace would find it difficult to forget the scene they saw today for a long time in the future. In reality, at the time, they thought that after hearing the countless dirty curses of the Federation madman toward the Emperor's mother, they would certainly be immediately executed to prevent the filth from spreading to more people's ears. Unexpectedly, the Emperor didn't execute them afterward. Perhaps it was because the Emperor was too tired. The blood-soaked bandages fluttered in all directions like the feathers of a bird. They then fell and spread out around Su Li's body in a large area. Some of the blood had solidified into black paint, while others were as bright as new blood. There was even more blood that flowed out from the large and small wounds on his body and dripped down his thighs to the ground. It was an unusually terrifying sight. Sula did not faint. Because of the excessive blood loss, his cheeks were unusually pale. A trace of indifference and ruthlessness still hung on his face. His head drooped weakly, but his eyes were still forcefully open. He stared viciously at the emperor in front of him. It looked like he was rolling his eyes in disdain. Huai Fuchai's right hand held the whip tightly. There was a trace of loneliness in his cold expression. Under the robe, his chest rose and fell continuously. The long period of whipping seemed to have used up a lot of the emperor's strength. His gaze was still calm, but there was an additional trace of complicated and indescribable emotion in his expression. He looked silently at the bloody man in front of him and listened to the last curse word that was so slightly hoarse that it was almost inaudible. Suddenly, his brows furrowed and he let go of his right hand. The blood-stained whip fell into the pool of blood and bloomed with a few blossoms of blood. Huai Fuchai silently turned around and walked past the giant golden sunflower screen. He walked back to the dark and noble soft couch. Gently brushing his robe, he calmly sat down. He stared blankly at the large classical brick wall. He seemed to be somewhat tired. Then he raised his hand and waved it tiredly. 2 fingers cut through the air, deciding Su Li's life and death. In the sea of mulberry trees, you gave me some surprises, but compared to that, today I feel even more admiration. Outside the maglev elevator, Huai Chaosher looked at the blood-covered Su Lu. After a moment of silence, he said, I am very sorry. The dignity I once promised has been a little unexpected today. However, I can guarantee that you will die by execution and not by torture. The half-lying Su Lu struggled to open his swollen eyes. He wanted to say something, but in the end he could only weakly spit out a few drops of blood. He could only helplessly smile. Huai Chaosher took a handkerchief from a subordinate's hand and helped him wipe away the blood at the corner of his mouth. The Empire's medical team had already rushed over. Large doses of cardiac stimulants and muscle relaxants were injected into Su Li's body. The smell of the medical glue, for a short time, actually covered up the fragrance of the flowers in the royal palace. After a period of treatment, Su Lu finally recovered some of his energy. In a raspy voice, he said in a low voice, Just now, seeing your emperor's hand gesture, I should be immediately executed. Why are you still treating me? I said, I will let you die with dignity. Huai Chaosher furrowed his brows slightly and replied, I cannot stop the emperor's anger, but before you die, you will certainly enjoy the treatment a soldier deserves. I won't say thank you. Su Li's eyes were so swollen that only a slit remained. He looked at Huai Chaosher's face through the slit and suddenly remembered a derogatory proverb from the Federation. In a raspy voice, he said, Because I won't express any thanks to those who want to kill me. If you had the chance to kill me, what would you do? Huai Chaosher asked. Of course I would kill you. Su Li's reply was very honest. In the foreseeable future, the princess in front of him was, without a doubt, the most powerful and terrifying enemy of the Federal Army. If there was a chance to eliminate her from history ahead of time, no Federation soldier would hesitate in the slightest, even if she was a young woman. Huai Chaosher smiled. To be able to prove one's ability from the mouth of the most outstanding enemy officer, one's mood was not too bad. Before you die, what words do you have to say? In the future, when the Empire occupies the Federation, I can pass on your words to the people of the Federation. The Empire occupies the Federation? The weak Su Lu was not in the mood to continue arguing with her. He blinked with difficulty and asked, Are these my last words? When did the Empire treat the captives of the Federation so well? This is to thank you for bringing back the diary of that officer, Huai Chaosher replied. Was he going to give out his last words again? Su Lu thought of the conversation he had with Bai Yulan on the summit of White Cliff Peak at 3,320 years ago. A trace of emotion appeared on his wounded and miserable face. After a long silence, he looked at Huai Chaosher and said in a raspy voice, I don't have any last words. I just want to know what Feng Yu, that Nasri you all speak of, what is his relationship with the Empire? He is one of the people closest to me in my life. The government said that he is a traitor, and the charter determined that he is the #1 wanted criminal, but I don't believe it. Sulu painfully coughed a few times. He gasped for breath and said, Your emperor hates him very much. This is very good. He supports my rebellion. This matter is truly very important to me. Hearing Su Li's last request before his death, Huai Chaoshi was also silent for a long time. The fingers behind her moved slightly, chasing away all of the doctors and guards. Only the two of them were left in the secluded corner of the royal palace. The Federation believes that he is a traitor? An extremely strong trace of mockery appeared at the corners of her lips. Things in this world are truly very strange. In my opinion, your father and Li Pifu, this pair of brothers, are, without a doubt, the most shameless pair of traitors in the history of the Empire. Su Li's body should be very weak after being crazily whipped by the thorns. His hearing was somewhat damaged. The blood that flowed down his temples gradually coagulated when it entered his ears. The sounds of the outside world seemed even more indistinct. He tilted his head slightly with difficulty, wanting to clearly hear what Huai Chaoshi was saying. Uncle Feng Yu and military god Li Pifu were traitors to the Empire? Or did he hear wrong? F***CK. Chapter 610. A few years ago, in the Met Combat Training Room in Section H1 of the Yue University Library, Su Li used the channel of burning energy to replace the nerves and veins in his body, transmitting the instructions from his brain to every part of his body. From that day on, he became one of the most thick-skinned people in the universe. Until now, when the channel collapsed, the burning energy was still wandering in his body, and his nerves were even thicker than before. Therefore, many things that could shock ordinary people to the point of prostrating themselves on the ground or even trembling all over could not shake his stubborn heart that was as dull as a stone. Being whipped crazily by the Emperor was a rare treatment, but it didn't shock him. He was weak and paralyzed, and he was brutally beaten until he was covered in blood. His wounds were so horrible that even though you might not be able to recognize him, but he was still able to smile. He didn't care, and he wasn't shocked at all. Even when the Emperor revealed the secret he had buried for a long time, the secret between him and Uncle Feng Yu, the surprise in his heart calmed down, and there wasn't much shock left in him. Until now, when he heard Huai Caoshi's words full of mockery and resentment, he was finally shocked and could not speak for a long time. The god of war Li Pifu galloped in the universe, shining brightly and reaching the peak of personal strength, almost like a god. Uncle Feng Yu's body shook, fighting against more than 10 military mechs with his bare hands. He was so strong that it was dazzling. No one knew when this pair of brothers suddenly appeared in the Federation, showing their extraordinary strength in different fields in light and shadow, fighting against the glory of the Empire and the Charter. However, their ability was not passed down. No matter how many close combat masters there were in the Philadelphia Cultivation Gym, even geniuses like Mr. Tian, no one could approach the level of the brothers. According to Huai Chaoshi, the Jinshi that Uncle Feng taught him should be called 8 rice, and this Jinshi was the secret ability of the imperial family. It seemed that this was enough to explain many things. They are from the Empire? Sula did not need to squint his swollen eyes to express his inner feelings as usual. He stared at Huai Chaoshi in front of him and asked in an incredulous tone. After a long silence, Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes and said, Fortunately or unfortunately, the people of the Empire can hardly learn the ingratitude of the people of the Federation. Sulu understood this sentence and suddenly felt a wave of relief mixed with lingering fear. If the Federation's war god and his teacher were really brothers of the Empire, he really found it hard to accept this absurd fact. However, following Huai Caoshi's denial, even more questions poured into his mind. If the brothers Li Pifu were not from the Empire, where did they learn their amazing abilities? Why was the imperial family so familiar with Uncle Feng Yu's incarnation? It was almost evening, and the red clouds were flying diagonally outside the high palace walls. The faint golden afterglow shone through those unknown trees and sprinkled on this quiet corner. They came to the Empire to study? When did that happen? Su Li's mechanic mode of thinking was calm enough and precise enough to immediately grasp the core of the problem. Nasri definitely came to the Empire when he was young, but the story between him and His Majesty should not be known by anyone in this universe. As for Li Pifu, there is no evidence to prove that before he led the army to invade the Empire, he came to planet Tianjing to study. I don't understand, Su Lu said hoarsely, his voice extremely weak. Huai Chaoshu glanced at him, shook her head, and said, "You're about to die. Why are you still concerned about this?" "It's because I'm about to die that I have the urge to know these secrets." Su Lu coughed and replied, I don't want to die with 800 question marks in my head. A hungry ghost is uncomfortable, but a curious ghost is even more uncomfortable. Yes, you're about to die. After a moment of silence, Huai Chaoshu said, "There's no harm in letting you know about the past of your father and uncle. Maybe you'll understand why the Empire is angry." This must be a very long story. Su Lu smiled with difficulty. I don't know if I can finish listening to it before I die. I don't know much about the details of what happened back then. Huai Chaoshu looked at him and pressed the electric button beside the self-restraining table. She said expressionlessly, "This is a very simple story. It's always good to have a story to listen to before you die." Huai Chaoshu returned to silence and walked toward the corner of the palace. The self-restraining table that bound Su Lu made a low electric sound and followed his back as he moved forward, walking further and further away under the bright red sunset. The Empire's military officers and doctors behind did not hear the conversation between the two of them. They looked at the two long and narrow backs that were gradually moving away and could not help but look at each other. Then they quietly followed from afar. This scene was very interesting. A death row prisoner wrapped in restraints, bandages, and medical glue like a Nanling specialty brown rice bag was like a paralyzed old man who could not walk. He leaned against the self-restraining table and followed the young man in front of him who had his hands behind his back. His body was thin but gave off an aura that was more valiant than the huge palace. They slowly walked under the high palace walls in the twilight. It was like two people who appreciated each other were saying goodbye. It was a farewell. "Do you see that building?" Huai Chaoshu stood on the high palace wall and squinted at the civilian district in the west shrouded in the twilight. She pointed at a completely white courtyard in the midst of the low residential buildings. Su Li's eyes were swollen. He looked with difficulty for a long time and then nodded. He did not know what the little story before his death had to do with that inconspicuous courtyard. That is the most sacred place in the entire empire other than the imperial palace. Huai Chaoshu had a leisurely expression. The Great Master Fan Manor. The Great Master Fan Manor. Su Lu silently repeated this strange name in his mind. He felt like he had heard of it somewhere before. The Great Teacher is the most respected title in the empire, but not many people know about it because they do not care about the reputation in the secular world. Huai Chaoshu slowly explained. Every great teacher is a rare genius. Perhaps it is in the academic field, the economic field, or some other field. In short, they are the most secret and also the most important foundation of the empire. "You mean?" Su Lu was confused and asked. "This position is hereditary." "Correct. A family that always produces geniuses." After a moment of silence, Su Lu shook his head with difficulty and said, "I am a member of the Federation. I believe in equality. I do not believe that fate itself will create this kind of unfairness. There has never been such a thing as innate fairness in the universe." Huai Chaoshu said indifferently. "Only those with royal blood have the chance to master the 8 rice true qi. This is unfair, but it is also the truth. So you have to admit that the Creator has chosen the royal family to lead the ordinary people of the empire from the beginning. The war god and the Nasri brothers are not people of the empire, so naturally, it is impossible for them to have royal blood. I'm also not from the empire, but we have both mastered it." Huai Chaoshu narrowed his eyes, seemingly troubled by this question. After a long silence, he said, "Perhaps the Creator has chosen you and the Lee brothers on your side. Should I feel honored?" Sulu shook his head. "You should feel honored." Huai Chaoshi gave a simple comment and said directly, "Now, let us begin this simple story. Please." After or before the Empire and the Federation met, an Empire spaceship passed through the space channel and entered the Federation's territory, landing in a place called Feiqing. Wait, there are many logical problems at the beginning of this simple story. Sulu did not care about his weak body and firmly retorted, "The Empire's space technology was even more backward than it is now. It was not enough to support a spaceship to cross the galaxy. Besides, even if that spaceship flew over, it would not have been able to hide from charter and silently land in the capital ring. As I said, I don't know too many details. I just want to tell a simple story." Huai Chaoshi stood in the twilight, frowning as if a fire was about to ignite. She was not used to this guy being so stubborn even before death. "And I firmly believe that the spaceship can do it because this is the foundation of the story, because the passenger on the spaceship is the former great teacher." Sulu was silent for a long time before saying, "All right, what's the end of the story?" "The former great teacher of the Empire found a pair of brothers who could cultivate the 8 rice true qi in the Federation's Feiqing. So he taught them. At that time, the pair of brothers were still children. They were pure enough and talented enough. They grew up very quickly, so quickly that they surpassed the great teacher's imagination. The problem was that when they grew up, they were no longer pure. The older brother changed his name to Li Pifu and participated in the invasion of the Empire, completely ignoring the fact that the Empire was his teacher's hometown. Then one day, this man called Li Pifu assassinated the Emperor of the Empire. In that battle, he even used the 8 rice true qi he had learned in the Empire to kill his teacher. And then, there's no then. The setting sun outside the palace walls was like a crack in Su Li's eyes, from which countless streams of blood flowed. Huai Caoshi's simple words described a major event that had happened several decades ago. Perhaps this major event would never be recorded in history, but that great teacher who was far away from the Empire, those 2 ignorant children who were learning true qi in Feiqing, had personally written a few lines of words in history that could never be erased. In this simple story, there was the former great teacher's inconceivable journey into space, the integration and separation of races, the friendly teaching and ruthless betrayal, and the great psychological struggle and painful torment of races. There was also blood. This is truly an extraordinary story. Sulu knew that she had no reason to lie to him at this moment. Although there were still countless questions that had not been answered, just this information alone was enough to make him shocked again and again, perplexed again and again. Chapter 611. Decades ago, even in the last constitutional calendar, an ordinary private spaceship swayed alone through countless stars and dust, through the complex and dangerous space channel of the Night Scorpion Nebula, and mistakenly entered a completely unfamiliar galaxy. Somehow, it avoided the omnipresent glory of the Charter and came to the Federation, which had been in peace for thousands of years. It was so quiet that it was about to decay. At that time, the Federation, the first generation of anti-government forces without any political program, had just taken shape in the Green Dragon Mountain. The leader of Nanshui had not been born yet, and he should not have been born yet. This group of workers who escaped from factories in the 4 states around the mountains only had wrenches and heavy loading machines in their hands, and other weapons in their hands. At that time, the Federation, the 7,000-year-old families gradually hid their huge bodies behind the scenes of the historical truth. The government and the management committee became stronger and stronger, and the strength of the federal military was as scattered and weak as it had been in the past tens of thousands of years. Because there was no enemy, the West Mountain compound was a forgotten corner of the people. At that time, the Federation was a peaceful society. People enthusiastically praised the countless different styles of Master Schiller's plays, and were content to find excitement from those bizarre and strange stories to pass the time of their stagnant lives. At the same time, they also balanced the boredom caused by years of eating synthetic protein meat. At that time, in the Federation, the Zhong family controlled the 4th military region in the West Woods, carefully keeping a distance from the Federation government. In the more distant East Woods region, the lack of crystal resources forced the enterprises under the Tai family to increase the speed of excavation in the deep crust of the earth. From time to time, uncontrollable mining accidents accompanied by small earthquakes occurred in this troubled land. A spaceship from the Empire quietly landed in such a federation. The young man walked out of the spaceship curiously and excitedly looked at everything new around him. There was a small device in his jacket pocket that kept emitting faint blue light. The young man from the Empire hid his identity, avoiding the glory of the charter and wandering or traveling in the Federation. No one knew where he went and how long he stayed. They could only guess that at some point in time, he saw 2 young boys under the reflection of the snow mountain in a place called Feiching, a place that had now been designated as a forbidden area by the Federation government. The 2 boys' surnames were Li. The young man from the Empire was pleasantly surprised to find that the 2 boys could actually sense qi. For some reason that no one knew, he chose to stay in a foreign and incomprehensible city to personally educate the 2 boys. Many years later, the young man from the Empire became a middle-aged man with a green beard. Homesick, he returned to his hometown. Many years later, the flames of war between the Federation and the Empire continued. After a night of painful psychological struggle, the 2 brothers chose a completely different direction in life. Because the way they treated war and the way they treated their teacher was completely different from the way they treated betrayal of kindness. These 2 equally brilliant and moving brothers had an intense quarrel and even a fight. Their palms fell down, their teeth bit their tongues, and they were shaken to the ground with blood. Ever since then, they had fallen out. The elder brother wiped away his pained expression and changed his name to join the military. He entered the 1st military region as a 17 mechanic. He wore a military uniform and piloted a mechanical suit, beginning a dazzling career as a military god. The younger brother wiped away his lonely expression and quietly disappeared into the sea of people. From then on, the Federation had 1 less mechanical genius, but the capital university had 1 more historical and political scientist. After a few years of blankness, the Federation society had gained many more extraordinary characters. When the Federal Army entered the Empire's territory, a fierce battle broke out. Li Pifu rushed thousands of miles. That black M37 mecha was on the verge of collapse. Like a bolt of lightning, it blasted into the depths of the Empire's military camp that was heavily protected by countless Empire's royal mecha, causing an explosion that changed the direction of the battle. The explosion stirred up a cloud of dust. The Emperor of the Empire fell to the ground with an expression of disbelief. Beside him, an old man looked at the approaching shadow of the mecha with a complicated and inexplicable gaze until it was reduced to ashes. This old man had once been young. He had once traveled the universe. He had once taught 2 little boys in a puzzling city in the Federation. Many years later, he had inexplicably died at the hands of one of the little boys. At that time, in the dimly lit cockpit of the mecha, what kind of expression would Li Pifu have on his face? After knowing this, what kind of expression would Feng Yu have on his face? After a few more years, Li Pifu, who had already become the Federation's military god, led the Federal Army in a large-scale attack on the Empire. However, because of that strange explosion, all of his previous efforts have been wasted. What did this have to do with Feng Yu's expression back then? Was this how the number 1 wanted criminal of the Federation, the number 1 traitor of the Empire, was trained? In the blood-red twilight, Su Lu, bound by restraints, narrowed his eyes and looked into the distance. His face full of red and swollen wounds looked somewhat comical, but at this moment, it was shrouded in a layer of seriousness and even solemnity. Ink painting needed to be left blank. Life also needed blank. Huai Chaosher had told an extremely simple story, but his mind automatically filled in the blanks left behind. Countless scenes flashed before his eyes like they were real. He was inexplicably shocked, and his heart was filled with endless emotions. What was history? This was true history. Those secret scrolls of the magnificent era gradually unfolded before his eyes. Moreover, these scrolls were also related to him. How could he not be moved? Under the Twilight Palace walls, there was a long silence. Huai Chaoshi quietly looked at the luster on his face, experiencing the emotions in his heart at this moment. She suddenly felt a faint emotion in her heart. The great teacher, he must be an extraordinary person. A hoarse voice finally broke the silence on the palace walls. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the conspicuous white courtyard in the distant commoner district. Someone who could enter the Federation alone and avoid the glory of the Charter was obviously not simple. What was even more frightening was that he was actually able to teach Li Pifu and Uncle Fengyu, these two terrifying powerhouses. Huai Chaoshi didn't answer with her hands behind her back. In the eyes of the Empire's royal family, those fellows from the Great Teacher Fan Manor never needed to be suspected. But I still have a question. There's no way to find the answer from this story. Sulu turned his head with difficulty and asked in a hoarse voice, "Why does your father hate Nasri so much?" Huai Chaoshi slowly closed her slightly narrowed eyes. In a gradually cooling night wind, she pondered for a long time. She thought about the anger her father had when he launched the attack on the West Woods, the anger today, that Federation national girl, and the metal bracelet on her wrist. I don't know. She paused for a moment and suddenly said, "The Empire's royal family has been connected by marriage with the Great Teacher Fan Manor for generations. My mother is the youngest daughter of the former Great Teacher Fan, but I heard that she died many years ago." Vaguely, Sulu always felt that Huai Caoshi's words revealed a trace of quiet emotion, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't say it. The setting sun in the distance fell a little lower, but the sunset in the sky was a little thicker. The twilight on the palace walls was even thicker. He looked at Huai Caoshi's pair of black eyebrows that were about to completely burn on her delicate face and said, "Thank you for telling me this before I die. Yes, and thank you for telling me those secrets on the spaceship, although it seems that I can't win this bet." Thinking of the bet with Sulu without words, Huai Caoshi's eyebrows raised slightly, and she smiled but didn't say anything. When it was time to say goodbye to each other, the two of them were the best of the younger generation in the Federation and the Imperium. They were destined to be enemies who could not live under the same sky, but they had fought together, escaped together, and talked to each other. After you die, I might be even lonelier. This is indeed a regret. Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes and said calmly, "You won't be lonely for too long." Sulu understood what she meant. He also narrowed his eyes and looked at the sunset on the horizon. He said with a difficult smile, "In the future, you will meet a guy called Li Feng. He's younger than you and me, but when it comes to mecha combat, he's actually stronger than me. The legendary Madman Li? With your endorsement, I don't think I'll be too disappointed." Huai Chaoshi said expressionlessly, "But I regret that I can't fight with you. After you die, it'll probably be difficult to find another partner in this universe who can fight with me." Yes, the feeling of fighting side by side with Sang Shuhai is really not bad. Sulu paused for a moment and then smiled. But the question is, if we work together, who has the right to be our enemy? No one. Humanity has never encountered a truly hostile intelligent species in the universe. Huai Chaoshi suddenly raised the hand behind her back and stretched lazily in the twilight. She said calmly, "So we can only fight with ourselves? We're all humans. Both sides know this very well. But neither side will admit it unless one side completely defeats the other. Why bother?" Sulu shook his head. "Our generation probably doesn't have the wisdom to solve this problem. Let's leave it to future generations." Huai Chaoshi also shook her head. The twilight was as red as blood. Huai Chaoshi looked at his tragic face and nodded slightly. "Goodbye. I understand. This means we'll meet again in the next life." Sulu smiled and nodded. Huai Chaoshi stood on the wall and watched the back of that figure being escorted away by the Empire's soldiers. Her brows slowly furrowed. This fellow, who clearly knew he was going to die, did not have the slightest trace of madness. He was actually so curious about the past. After knowing the answer, he was so satisfied and smiled so sincerely. Unless one had a pure heart that had been washed by the clear spring of the snowy mountains for 1,000 years, who else could do this? Watching that figure disappear into the twilight, she suddenly thought of the words engraved on the stone wall of Great Master Fan's manor. The future of those with pure hearts is boundless. She had spent her childhood and the first few years of her adolescence in Great Master Fan's manor. She had never liked these words with a sour and literary tone. She had silently cursed them countless times, but today she suddenly felt that these words were somewhat reasonable. It was indeed easy for pure people to become strong. She stood in the night wind on the palace wall, silently thinking for a long time. Only when the twilight completely disappeared and the darkness enveloped the houses and the white courtyard did she slowly raise her head. At this moment, an imperial major ran over and heavily kneeled on the ground. With a trembling voice, he said, "Your Highness, he ran away." Chapter 612. In the instant that Huai Chaoshu raised her head, she was lamenting over Su Li's death. In her noble and lonely life, there was one less opponent who was qualified to be her enemy. As a rare person with sufficient strength and qualifications to sigh so deeply that no one would feel disgust or ridicule. In an instant, this sigh of regret quickly transformed into a firm determination. The late emperor and the great teacher had both died at the hands of Lipifu. My life's goal is to defeat Lipifu. Even if he is old and bedridden, I must still defeat him. The night wind blew in her face. Just as she was filled with lofty aspirations, she saw the officer run over in a panic and fall to his knees. She heard the officer say in a trembling voice, "Your Highness, he ran away." Huai Chaoshu furrowed her brows and narrowed her eyes. Just like how Su Lu had doubted her hearing a few minutes ago, she also began to doubt her ears. Her Highness was naturally talking about her. But who was he? Who ran away? Her furrowed brows suddenly rose, and a trace of coldness appeared in her narrowed eyes. She had clearly confirmed that his meridians were all broken and his entire body was paralyzed. Today, he had been beaten to such a weak state by the emperor. How could he run away under the escort of a group of fully armed soldiers? Huai Chaoshu walked down. Her military uniform was stiff and full of murderous intent. She slapped the officer heavily to the ground and scolded in a deep voice, "Useless thing." The officer struggled to stand up and once again lowered his head and knelt at her feet, not daring to make the slightest argument. Location. She quickly walked out of the palace and took the communication device from the hands of her subordinate. She knew that this news should have already reached her father's ears. Jingbo Lake, a spaceship has crashed. The escaping soldiers report that the prisoner is not in the cabin. The nearest guard battalion has already rushed over. The officer stood up and didn't even bother to pat the dust on his knees. He staggered behind her and reported in as concise and accurate a language as possible. Inform the Royal Transportation Department to close all docks and stations. Inform all district defense offices to turn on all chip scanning devices. Order the 2nd Royal Mecha Battalion to rush to Jingbo Lake as quickly as possible. Huai Chaoshu walked forward quickly. Using the equipment in her hands, she issued her orders to all the important departments on Tianjing Planet. Her expression was unusually cold. She did not know why Su Lu suddenly had the ability to move, nor did she understand why the bomb on his shoulder did not explode. A faint worry surfaced in her heart. After a moment, she regained her composure. Thinking of the chip behind that guy's neck, she took a deep breath and said expressionlessly, "Send out all the ground troops in the Weishu district. I want no one to miss anything within a 40-square-kilometer radius of Jingbo Lake. The focus of the search is the forest in the south. Advance in echelons and kill them all." The chips on the back of the Federation people's necks were like lights in the dark night. The buildings in the Empire District were densely packed with chip pulse monitoring devices to guard against Federation spies. Under such circumstances, if Su Lu wanted to escape, the only way was to leave the city and enter the deep mountains and forests. A few minutes ago, the 4 jets at the belly of a near-surface spaceship developed by the Empire continuously spat out high-pressure air, driving the spaceship away from the setting sun quickly and steadily. It brushed past the tall, ancient triangular maple trees and flew towards its destination in the south of Tianjing Planet's capital. The bright yellow and red leaves retreated quickly outside the window, blending into the last of the blood-red twilight and returning to darkness. Su Lu, who was completely bound, sat quietly in the middle cabin near the cockpit. He looked at the beautiful scenery on the ground through the glass window in silence. No one knew what he was thinking about. The Empire soldiers in charge of escorting him knew that this Federation captive was about to be executed, so they did not care about his silence at this moment. Although they knew that this person was completely paralyzed, the soldiers still strictly followed the safety regulations. For elite Special Forces soldiers stared at him from all 4 directions. There were no guns around them. At the front and back of the long and narrow cabin were dozens of fully armed soldiers. Even if the completely paralyzed Su Lu suddenly went on a killing spree, he would not be able to grab a weapon and would immediately be turned into a pile of meat paste by the dense rain of bullets. The spaceship vibrated slightly as it flew silently. The night outside the window grew darker and darker, especially when the horizon in the distance was already as dark as ink. Only the lake still shone like a beautiful gem. Su Lu quietly looked at the lake that was getting closer and closer. When he came, he had specially paid attention to this lake. He had calculated the difference between the spaceship and the lake, the speed of the spaceship, the reaction speed of the Empire soldiers, his own speed, and many, many other calculations. Calculating was for the sake of calculating, and risking his life was for the sake of survival. He would be executed in a moment. If he did not fight now, when would he? Thus, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the Empire soldier with a cold expression in front of him. He smiled and then lowered his head. The movement of lowering his head seemed ordinary and gentle, but just as his chin was about to touch his chest, he suddenly raised his head and pushed back. With a few shattering sounds, the restraint shattered. The back of Su Li's head smashed through the table and smashed into the forehead of the Empire soldier behind him. Almost at the same time, the bandages that tightly bound his body suddenly tightened. The hard synthetic fibers seemed to be affected by some kind of huge force and rapidly stretched as if they were about to break. Su Lu narrowed his swollen eyes and quickly lowered his head, slamming his head into the Empire soldier who was about to open his mouth and shout, "Head to the left, head to the right." For dull and terrifying sounds of skulls shattering rang out. The 4 Empire Special Forces soldiers around him did not even have time to make a sound before their skulls shattered, and they slid to the ground limply. At this time, the restraints on Su Li's body finally broke. Countless snowflake-like fragments of the dense fiber bands sputtered like a huge snowball bursting open. Amidst the flying bandages, his body turned into a black shadow and pounced forward with a roar. His feet stepped on the cabin wall, leaving a faint footprint on the alloy wall. His right hand seemed to have casually swept, and the heavy metal chair that he had calculated beforehand was in his hand. With a shake of his right arm, the scorching power that was wandering all over his body suddenly converged into an extremely powerful force. Accompanied by a violent roar, he threw the metal chair in his hand over. His speed was already extremely fast. This throw that contained the power he had been hiding for many days turned the metal chair into a stream of metal light. It cut through the air with a shrill sound and rushed forward at high speed, smashing into the group of armed soldiers. Countless pieces of flesh and blood burst out. The power was comparable to that of a cannonball. The distance of 7 meters was covered in an instant. With a loud bang, the heavy metal chair smashed into the cockpit door, creating a cloud of smoke and dust. Su Lu followed closely behind and ruthlessly kicked down. Because he used too much strength, The wound on his face at this moment burst open a little. Drops of blood splashed out. His facial features were extremely ruthless and looked extremely terrifying. In the end, the Empire soldiers responsible for guarding him were too relaxed. No one would have thought that a person who was judged by His Highness to be completely paralyzed could actually go on a rampage and kill people. He clearly looked very weak before, but once he went on a rampage, he was like a crazy tiger. It was not until Su Lu violently blasted open a bloody path with the chair and kicked open the cockpit that the Empire soldiers in the spaceship finally reacted and raised the guns in their hands. It had to be admitted that the reaction of the Empire soldiers at this moment perfectly displayed excellent military training and terrifying discipline. Seeing that the target was about to enter the cockpit, all the Empire soldiers who raised their guns did not seem to have considered the consequences of firing in the spaceship that would cause everyone to die together. They pulled the trigger without hesitation. Pooh, 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 pooh. Some of the bullets penetrated the alloy walls, while others bounced off and poured into the narrow cockpit like a torrential rain. Even though they knew that they would die, they still had to open fire because Su Lu had already entered the cockpit. They could not give him any chance to control the spaceship to force a landing. Su Lu never had the extravagant hope of being able to steal a spaceship and escape in front of a group of elite Empire soldiers. From the very beginning of the plan, his goal was very simple. It was not to steal the spaceship, but to destroy it. He slashed the pilot who was taking out his pistol with one hand, smashed the autopilot with one elbow, and stepped on the bottom of the control stick with one foot. Under the high-speed rain of bullets, he completed these three actions with lightning speed. He immediately shrunk his body under the seat and firmly pressed his left foot down. After the control stick was stepped onto the bottom, the four jets on the abdomen of the spaceship instantly adjusted their postures, and the power was increased to the maximum. The spaceship shook violently, and its head fiercely accelerated downward. The violent shaking and the sudden dive caused most of the bullets fired by the Empire soldiers behind the cabin to hit the top. The sharp bullets easily penetrated the cabin walls, revealing countless small holes, like the stars in the night sky, like sesame seeds on a sesame seed cake. The subsequent development was completely in line with Su Lu's calculations. The high-speed diving spaceship tore through the tall maple trees by the lakeside, and after two seconds, it resolutely rushed into the clear and open lake. The near-surface spaceship did not fly high, so the time between Su Lu's violent jump and falling into the lake was extremely short. However, when the heavy spaceship suddenly collided with the cold lake water, it still caused a huge water column and a terrifying loud noise. Diving into the lake at such a high speed, there was not much difference between the soft water surface and the hard concrete floor. The heavy alloy hull let out a sorrowful sound as it twisted and sank to the bottom of the lake along with the turbulent waves around it. The spaceship was destroyed. The Imperial soldiers in the cabin were sent flying in all directions by the tremendous impact before crashing heavily onto the ground. Some were unconscious, some were groaning in grievous wounds, and some were staring blankly at the lake water pouring in through the shattered windows. An officer's eyes were full of despair. He used the last of his strength to press the electronic bomb button at his waist, but there was no explosion as he expected in the cockpit. The lake water instantly submerged his body, washing away the blood he spat out. There was no one in the cockpit. People were dead. Su Lu began to flee. Chapter 613. Like an arrow and a fish, a human figure drew a white line and plunged into the depths of the cold, dark lake. The tremendous force from the crashed spaceship was clearly reflected in this straight line. A few bubbles overflowed from the top of the figure, did not have time to float before they were crushed by the fierce, invisible waves. At this time, it was already late at night. The autumn lake water was bone-chillingly cold, hitting one's face painfully. The medical glue was diluted, and there were traces of blood seeping out. However, like those bubbles, they quickly merged into the lake water, and no traces could be found. The tremendous pressure from all directions invaded him, but Su Li's miserable face did not show any reaction. He was very used to this environment. After sinking and suffocating in the hundreds of millions of tons of lake water on the Red Rose countless times, he was no longer afraid of water, only a sense of closeness with peace. He struggled to open his swollen eyes and swam to the bottom of the lake, holding the box he picked up from somewhere. He did not move, but his waist occasionally swayed like a fish, and his speed that was just slowed down by the lake water would increase again. When he touched a big rock at the bottom of the lake, he closed his lips and slowly adjusted his posture. He put his obviously stiff left leg into the crack of the rock and wedged his body so that he would not float up. Then he quickly opened the toolbox in his hand and took out a small device. He slowly turned his head and looked at the electrically controlled bomb ring in the bloody hole on his left shoulder. The high-speed rotating probe did not make any buzzing sound at the bottom of the lake, only a few beautiful water swirls. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Sula looked up and squinted at the lake. He could vaguely see lights flashing and the huge spiral arms of helicopters dancing. The people of the Empire came quickly, faster than he thought. After the four-cylinder floating spaceship crashed, the follow-up military aircraft in charge of escorting it did not land to rescue their colleagues. Instead, they directly began to search the lake, preventing him from escaping at the first moment. Then, more soldiers of the Empire came. He watched in silence for a moment, then lowered his head and continued his work. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes for minutes. In the depths of the lake, where there was no oxygen, he had forgotten to breathe. Faint wisps of blood seeped out of the wounds on his face and nostrils, rising slowly like red smoke. The scorching energy inside his body roamed freely like the bloody mist. It entered every cell of his body, nourished his lungs, refreshed his mind, and ensured his survival. A red light suddenly flashed on the electrical control strap on the wound on his left shoulder. Under normal circumstances, when a light of this color flashed, the plastic explosives locked in the alloy balls would directly blow his upper body into pieces. His injured and swollen eyelids had turned white from being soaked in the lake water. Su Lu closed his mouth tightly and continued to operate with his head lowered. He did not even blink. In fact, from the moment the spaceship crashed into the lake, the electronically controlled bombs on his shoulders had flashed red many times. Miraculously, there was no explosion. His mutilated and ugly corpse did not float up from the tranquil lake surrounded by the towering triangular maple forest, nor did a fish flip up its belly. The lake water in the depths of the lake slowly brushed against his black hair, like a clump of vigorous aquatic plants. He narrowed his eyes, silently and steadily disarming the bombs. From the moment he formulated this escape plan, the first thing he had to ensure was that the 2 bombs on his shoulders would not explode, and he had done it. Many days ago, lying in the intensive care ward of the Empire's 2nd Royal Hospital, his right index finger moved slightly under the clean white sheets. More than 10 days ago, the young nurse in charge of taking care of him lost a mobile phone. The corner of the bed was missing an inconspicuous metal screw and 2 even more inconspicuous steel wires. During those days and nights, he was like a real paralyzed patient, staring blankly at the snow-white ceiling above his head, the clean white sheets covering his thin body. None of the citizens of the Imperium could have imagined that, under the white bedsheet, his body could already move, but he did not. Instead, he turned the metal screws, wires, and mobile phones that had been dismantled into countless parts into slow-moving tools with his 5 fingers that were as nimble as a mechanic's genius. Disarming the sensitive electronically controlled bombs required very professional equipment. Even if the electronically controlled bombs could not receive signals, extremely precise tools were also required. However, for this Federation mechanic named Su Lu, a phone, a metal screw, and a few steel wires were enough. There was still no sound from the depths of the lake. Su Lu lowered his head to look at the electronically controlled bombs that were slowly peeling off from his shoulders. However, an extremely clear and pleasant click sounded in his heart. A hint of joy and relaxation flashed through his swollen eyes. After he was captured on the Red Rose, the electronically controlled bombs were bloodily tied to his shoulders. Even when he fought side by side with Huai Chaoshi in the Mulberry Sea, that Highness had never intended to remove them for him, because the Empire could not underestimate his ability. Once the burden of a serious threat to his life was removed, the mental pressure also disappeared. Sulu suddenly felt that his body was a lot lighter. He could not help but grin. However, his cheeks were full of red and swollen scars, and his white teeth had an unhealthy blood-red color. This smile could not help but be a bit strange. Still smiling happily, he reached out his hand and waved in the lake. He summoned a handful of lake water and splashed it on his face symbolically. He lightly stepped on the giant rock at the bottom of the lake, swayed his waist, and quietly swam to the surface of the lake like a big fish. He did not know how long he had held his breath at the bottom of the lake. Right now, he seemed to be able to survive without breathing for a short period of time. What was the difference between him and a fish? There was a bright light flashing on the surface of the lake. There was a faint vibration that went deep into the lake. The water waves refracted and reflected the light, turning into a strange mirror. He swam to this mirror. The spaceship crashed. The fugitive was a fugitive. Her Highness was furious. The Empire's troops around the capital of Tianjing planet moved at the fastest speed possible. In an extremely short period of time, thousands of soldiers firmly surrounded the lake. The high-powered searchlights were all turned on, illuminating the dark forest and lake as if it was daytime. Dozens of the Empire's latest model Wolf Fong mecha walked with heavy mechanical steps, closely patrolling the wetland by the lake. From time to time, huge maple trees would be knocked down, causing red leaves to fall all over the sky and startling countless night birds. On the surface of the lake, there were more than a dozen helicopters circling around. The strong wind of the spiral arms caused the lake water to splatter in all directions, as if a monster was about to drill out. Huai Chaoshi was personally on her way here. No matter how one looked at it, the Empire would definitely not allow Su Lu to truly escape. Moreover, he now knew even more secrets because of that ruthless and boring gambling game with Huai Chaoshi. Moreover, in the eyes of the Empire's emperor, his past was enough reason for him to die 800 times. On the western shore of the lake, in the low-lying water plants near the shadow of the forest, Su Lu slowly poked out half of his head. The lake water and sand silently slid down his face. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the bright, white lake surface. Looking at the light beams in the forest around the lake, he could not suppress his shock. The Empire's people really thought too highly of him. They actually set up such a large formation. Mournful dog barks came from several hundred meters away. Even closer to him was a military vehicle with an instrument's wave-receiving screen facing the lake water and slowly scanning. Su Li's pupils constricted. Without hesitation, he lowered his head and once again dove into the depths of the lake. The other party had actually mobilized military dogs and life detectors at the same time in such a short amount of time. Other than diving into the depths of the lake, there was nothing else he could do. Once he entered the depths of the lake, he was a fish that happily swam around. He was confident that the Empire's people would definitely not be able to find him. However, just as he began to dive, before he had time to happily swim, the movement on the lake's surface and the waves stirred up by the fierce wind attracted his attention. Looking at that enormous floating transport aircraft and the submarine hanging below it, Su Lu was tongue-tied. He was stunned speechless. Even a submarine was transported over. Huai Chaoshi, you really are ruthless. Su Lu silently praised in his heart. His body turned, and his legs quickly bounced as he swam toward the dark and safe depths of the lake. In the instant he emerged from the surface of the lake, Su Lu saw many details. He saw the other party's valiant determination, saw the north and south he wanted to see, and saw the things he didn't want to see. Continuing to hide at the bottom of the lake wasn't a solution. Based on the Empire's people's crazy search, Even if their target was a small river crab in a boulder at the bottom of the lake, it would still be easily dug out. He had to leave this lake as quickly as possible. The north side of the lake passed through a green park and was connected to planet Tianjing's capital city. In that heavily guarded capital city, every street, every apartment, and even every toilet had microchip monitoring devices specially designed to deal with Federation spies. The Federation's people entering that area was purely courting death. The south side of the lake was a lush red maple forest. This maple forest was artificially planted in the beginning, under the deliberate protection of the Empire's royal family. Under the long years of protection, it gradually became the rarest primeval forest on this planet. There were large trees and leaves that were large enough to cover one's body, and the difficult terrain that was most advantageous for escaping. Most importantly, there weren't many microchip monitoring devices in the primeval forest. The north side was dangerous. It was like a giant beast that had been silent for thousands of years. It was an ancient tomb full of traps, ready to swallow anyone who entered by mistake at any time. It wouldn't even spit out their bones. The south side was enticement. It was like a piece of white paper that anyone could paint on. A naked virgin attracted people to bravely move forward, using their own adventurous footprints to paint a beautiful picture. No matter from which perspective one looked at it from, Su Lu should choose to escape to the south. This had nothing to do with the inertia of his thinking. The objective environment of planet Tianjing determined that this was his only choice. The problem is that the Empire's people think this way, and so does Huai Chaoshi. Su Lu narrowed his eyes as he waved the ice-cold lake water. He silently swam towards the shore in the north. After an unknown amount of time, he unsurprisingly found the exit of the underground waterway at the bottom of the lake. A sincere smile once again appeared on his miserable face. Chapter 614. Where there was a city, there would be a lot of people. Where there were a lot of people, there would be a lot of garbage and wastewater. Regardless of whether it was treated or not, the filthy liquid mixed with vegetable leaves, watermelon peels, and feces had to be discharged. Due to the importance of sewers to human life, many historians had always insisted that a perfect underground drainage system was one of the most important inventions in human history. The quality of a city's drainage system directly reflected the level of the city's social civilization. As the largest city in the left sky starfield, Tianjing planet's capital city undoubtedly had the most developed drainage system in the empire. Thousands of square kilometers of the city's concrete underground, complex sewer pipes extended like a spider web. Some of the sewers could only allow hungry rats to crawl through, while most of the main sewers were built to be incomparably huge, so much so that it felt like they could accommodate battleships in space. Su Lu crawled for a long distance in the pitch-black sewers, then walked silently for a while. Looking at the huge sewer system in front of him, he couldn't help but shake his head. The cheerful song of optimism in his heart also temporarily stopped. He was like a fish swimming freely in the water. After climbing out of Maple Lake, fatigue and pain quickly invaded his body along with the dry air. The large amount of blood loss caused by the cruel whip made his body extremely weak. What was even more frightening was that at the moment when the spaceship fell into the lake, his left leg that was supporting the front desk of the cockpit had suffered too much force. Even though the magical burning power in his body had been completely unleashed, his leg and knee were still severely injured. There were signs of fractures. Another problem was that he didn't know where to go. In the 3-story underground space in front of him, there were more than 10 holes. Some of the holes were pitch black, while some of the holes were faintly lit. No one knew which sewer would lead to which part of the city, or would it circle back to the heavily surrounded lake. The drainage system of Tianjing, planet's capital city, was first designed thousands of years ago. Countless generations of administrators had continuously modified it, and half of the city's underground space had been hollowed out. The cobweb-like pipes were terrifyingly complex. Even if the engineers of the Empire's city management department came here with all the historical drawings, It was very likely that they would be trapped in a maze, unable to leave, and could only starve to death. Not to mention a foreigner like him who didn't have any maps. He looked around at a loss. The fifth cup of wine. The youth is about to fly, passing through the layers of forests. This young master is drinking so beautifully. After pondering in silence for a long time, he took out a water bag made of leaves and grass from the edge of his underwear and greedily drank the fifth mouthful of water. Then, he grinned and took a deep breath, as if he had drunk a mouthful of extremely strong wine. He took a few quick breaths to calm down the suffocating feeling in his chest and abdomen. His thin gray lips opened and closed silently, and he began to sing the familiar, sad melody again. The peaceful smile on his face was still there, and he actually sang a lot of happy feelings. The cold underground buildings around him and the imperial food bags and the sewage all carried the smell of hostility. In this lake, this forest, this city, this planet, and this universe, he could not get any help. He could only fight alone, a lonely and dangerous battle. He never knew where he would step next. If he did not have the heart to turn water into wine and sing sad songs into war songs, he would always fall into despair. But he was Su Lu, so he did not despair. After a short rest, he exhaled a mouthful of turbid air and moved his legs with difficulty, walking toward the complicated underground sewer in front of him. Since he did not know where to go, he just randomly picked a passage, because a fugitive always had to go forward, and walking was the foundation of all behavior. No one in the Empire thought that he dared to escape to the city through the underground sewer, and Huai Chaoshi did not think that either. So most of the troops chasing him were basically concentrated on the south side of Feng Lake. He quietly walked in the underground sewer for a long time, but he did not meet a single soldier of the Empire. Until now, like a wildcat wandering in the night, he quietly climbed up the rusty stairs to the platform in the sewer that was as high as two people and then stopped. In the dim light on the ground in front of him, there were a few dark figures. He could clearly see that these people were holding guns in their hands, and he could clearly hear them talking in a low voice in the Empire language with a dialect. The Empire's troops mainly focused on the forest on the south side of the lake, but they still sent people to control a few transit passages in the underground sewer. Obviously, both Her Majesty and Huai Chaoshi felt endless anger toward his successful escape and did not want to leave any gap for him to fly out. It was very strange that the air in the underground sewer was very dry with the sound of water splashing. Su Lu stood in the corner and silently listened to the subtle sounds in front of him. He pursed his dry lips and slowly took off the leaf bag tied to his underwear. He squatted down and put it by his feet without making any sound. After falling into the lake, except for the very comfortable cotton underwear, Su Lu did not have a single piece of clothing on his body. The clear lines of muscles on his naked and thin body quietly hid under his skin. As he squatted, the lines slowly appeared, as if they were accumulating strength. A dry wind blew in the dark sewer. Su Lu was like a hunting cheetah. Along with the wind, he was faster than the wind. He quietly bounced up and pounced toward the front left. His bare right foot continuously stepped on the dry ground. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. His body seemed to have turned into a light smoke as he quickly killed his way to the front of the three dumbfounded Empire soldiers. These Empire soldiers who were responsible for guarding the entrance to sewer number 45 thought that it was just a very ordinary duty. They did not expect that the fugitive from the Federation would be so bold as to choose to sneak into the underground sewer. They also did not expect that the fugitive would dare to attack them with his bare hands. One of the Empire soldiers reacted extremely quickly. He raised his gun and aimed at the figure, preparing to pull the trigger. However, in the next moment, he discovered in despair that his right index finger could not pull the trigger at all. This was because Su Li's hand had already arrived first. With a crisp crack, Su Li's right hand bizarrely bounced out from under his left elbow with a whoosh. It ruthlessly smashed into the elbow of the Empire soldier who was holding the gun. The ruthless blow was directed against the joint, instantly shattering this person's elbow. Almost at the same time, his left hand quickly bounced out and pierced this person's throat like a bolt of lightning. Then, his left hand bounced back at an even faster speed. He did not even look at this Empire soldier who was helplessly clutching his throat. His 5 fingers spread out, and with his shoulder as the axis, he violently slapped down at another Empire soldier with incomparable ferocity. The second Empire soldier did not have time to shoot. He only had time to subconsciously block in front of him with his gun, blocking that incomparably violent palm. The palm wind howled fiercely. Su Li's eyes narrowed slightly. His face was expressionless as he unreasonably slapped down. Together with that ice-cold gun, he slapped down on the second Empire soldier's face. A terrifying muffled sound rang out. The face of the Imperial soldier was like soft cream, with a bloody gunshot mark and a palm print added to it. He didn't even make a sound before he fell stiffly to the ground. There was still one last Empire soldier. Su Li's right leg kicked forward, his right elbow raised diagonally, and struck viciously toward that person's eyebrows. This was the most commonly used move among the 10 powerful melee techniques that were deeply ingrained in his bones. However, to his surprise, this elbow was actually blocked by that Empire soldier. Su Li's eyes suddenly lit up. Without hesitation, his right leg went forward again, his left hand pulled back, and his fingertips went straight for the other party's throat. He flicked his finger, twisted his wrist, swung his elbow, and pushed his knee. The other party moved his finger, twisted his wrist, chopped his elbow, and kicked his leg. Bam, 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 bam. A series of dense sounds of flesh colliding rang out in the quiet underground sewer, producing strange echoes. In a gloomy underground sewer, it was almost impossible to see the 2 fiercely fighting figures clearly. The 2 parties in the battle had no time to think, no time to make a judgment. They could only rely on their battle instincts that had been honed for countless years to carry out absolute melee combat. At this moment, Su Li vividly displayed the 10 stances that he had learned since he was a teenager. His eyes grew brighter and brighter, but he could not see that Empire soldier's face clearly. He only knew that the other party could not make any sound for help under his suppression. 2 pairs of tough hands finally clashed together like 2 weapons from the cold weapon era, unable to be separated like cast iron. Every finger of both parties tightly clawed at the other party's wrist, blood spurting out. Without any warning, Su Li's injured left leg that had been dragging behind suddenly bounced up and violently struck the Empire soldier's ribs. With a muffled grunt, Su Li did not give the other party any chance to counterattack. Using the force of this kick, he bounced up. His hand was still firmly holding onto the other party's wrist. His right knee kicked out again, right in the middle of that person's chest. That extremely powerful Empire soldier finally could not resist this sharp chain of attacks. He spat out a mouthful of blood and fell into the dirty water below, creating a splash. He either fainted or died with the waves. The heavily injured left leg landed on the ground with a sharp pain. Su Li's face suddenly paled. He staggered back a few steps, but he tightly pursed his lips and did not make any sound. After a few hurried breaths, he looked with a trace of lingering fear at the sewer below that had already calmed down. He then looked at his bleeding wrist. How could there be such a strong person among ordinary Empire soldiers? The details of the dangerous battle quickly flashed in his mind. Su Li's expression suddenly became a little strange. He always felt that there was a very strange atmosphere before, but the real reason for this atmosphere could not be grasped. He only remembered that when both parties were holding hands, his fingertips seemed to have touched an extremely hard thing. Was it a watch or a bracelet? He lowered his head and looked at his left wrist. The ordinary-looking metal bracelet was now covered in blood and looked extremely hideous. Subconsciously, a trace of expectation and doubt appeared on his face. His fingertips gently rubbed the edge of the bracelet. Chapter 615. Su Li's breathing became heavy, not because of his injuries, but because of the faint light emitted by the bracelet on his wrist. The surface of the bracelet flowed like mercury, and light suddenly shot out from within, condensing in the air not far in front of him. The starry dots converged into lines, and the lines converged into a structure. The structure glowed with a beautiful starry sky, and it clearly displayed a map. The several rough passages on the complicated map accurately matched the complex underground waterway in front of him. The map of the Federation's major secret prisons was hidden in the bracelet left by the uncle. This was confirmed a long time ago, and there were also some drawings in the bracelet that he didn't know where they were from. Only now did he confirm them. It was actually a top-secret map of the Empire's capital city of Tianjin. Feng, you must have been to the Empire before. From the Emperor's anger and the story told by Huai Chaoshu, this could be confirmed. However, the fact that such a treasure was hidden in the bracelet was still beyond Su Li's imagination. Since he had already encountered the enemy, the Empire should soon discover his whereabouts. Although he was shocked, he didn't have time to digest this emotion. Using his superhuman mental control, he calmed his rapid breathing, raised his black eyebrows slightly, and stripped off the Empire's military uniform and boots as quickly as possible. At the same time, he picked up the gun and the Empire's internal communication system. At this moment, he didn't need to force himself to be optimistic and sing the sad song of 27 glasses of wine in a half-crazy state. Wearing the ill-fitting military boots, he looked at the three-dimensional map in the air in front of him and walked in the direction indicated by the map without thinking. He gasped in his heart and made hissing sounds. The dark, underground waterway instantly swallowed his figure, and only the faint light on his wrist flickered like a firefly, but it was exceptionally quiet. Breathing heavily, he opened the bracelet with his fingers. There were maps of the Federation's major prisons inside, and there were also maps that he didn't know what they were. Looking at the whole, he put them together and walked in. He was so shocked that he stopped singing. Wearing the ill-fitting shoes, he gasped all the way and walked into the dark tunnel. Hiss, 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 hiss. A convoy of armored vehicles and bulletproof heavy vehicles sped along the empty streets of the capital city. Due to the sudden incident, the entire city entered a state of emergency. The order of curfew was issued to every family. The nervous military police spread out like hunters at every corner of the city. No civilians dared to walk on the streets. All the streets and alleys were dead silent. This group of carriages tore through the thick darkness of the night and headed south. In this kind of night, the streets were like ghosts, causing people to feel fear in their hearts. Your Highness, orbital conversion number 7 is already in place. As long as the search team comes into contact with the target, we can immediately pinpoint its exact location. Jesse, the head of the Imperial Military Tactical Warfare Bureau, frowned as he spoke to his subordinates in a low voice. He raised his head to look at the young officer in the back and said in a deep voice, "The dense formation is ready to launch. As long as the precise positioning is successful, a dense bombardment will definitely destroy the target." Huai Chaoshu calmly moved her eyes away from the light screen in front of her. She glanced at the hardline subordinate who came from the military and coldly shook her head, rejecting this proposal. For some reason, she, who was angered by Su Li's bizarre escape, didn't choose to take the faster fighter to the Maple Lake area. Instead, she chose to go south by car. "Your Highness, I admit that the political situation is indeed not stable right now. The remnants of the rebellion of the nobles haven't been dealt with yet. At this time, it is indeed difficult to explain a big explosion in the suburbs of the capital city." Director Jesse tried to persuade her, but this person from the Federation is the murderer of County King Carlton and Prince Doring. His Majesty is very angry. Those nobles of the Senate who went to see him in the hospital. He looked at Huai Chaoshu hesitantly and said in a low voice, "A lot of people know that he was captured by you, but they also know the things that happened on Living Star. If we can't get rid of him as soon as possible, I'm afraid there will be some unfavorable rumors about you." Huai Chaoshu looked at him and narrowed her eyes. Director Jesse suddenly felt that the temperature in the car dropped a lot. It was a bit cold and piercing to the bone. He hesitantly closed his mouth. I know better than anyone how dangerous this person from the Federation is. His death is also very important to stabilize the mood of the nobles. If it is necessary, I am even willing to throw all the high-energy bombs stored by the military into Maple Lake and blow up that big lake into a scorched pit. Huai Chaoshu looked at her most loyal subordinate indifferently. She didn't get angry. She slowly said, "But I don't think that the troops by the lake can accurately pinpoint his location in such a short time." Director Jesse frowned. Although he was incomparably respectful of Her Highness in front of him, Her Highness' words were equivalent to not trusting the ability of the Empire soldiers. He faintly expressed admiration for that fugitive from the Federation. He couldn't help but say, "That's impossible. Although the terrain of the South Coast Forest is complicated, I've already sent over 10,000 troops and several dozen Wolfang machines. Even if they can't kill him, finding him shouldn't be a problem." Huai Chaoshu raised her head and looked at the night sky outside the car window. She didn't answer her subordinate's question and asked, "Has there ever been a Federation person in history that could survive for an hour on Tianjing planet?" "No." Director Jesse's answer was very resolute and decisive. "So don't be too nervous. Once a person is chained, no matter how strong they are, they can only become a dog tied to a wooden stake. No matter how much they struggle, they can't run too far." Huai Chaoshu's gaze returned to the screen of light. She examined the situation map sent back from the surroundings of Maple Lake. A trace of a smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. There was a trace of coldness in that smile. She silently thought of that fellow who was currently running for his life. "I'll let you bloom once more in the last moments of your life." The interior of the car once again sank into a deathly silence. After a long time, there was still silence. The search and capture team in front of Maple Lake still hadn't reported back with the latest situation. After Director Jesse contacted his subordinates again, his expression became even more unsightly. He hesitantly glanced at Her Highness, who seemed to be resting with her eyes closed, and said in a low voice, "We still haven't found the target. The majority of the South Bank's troops have been combed through. They haven't encountered any attacks. The detectors and submarines also haven't detected any abnormalities in the lake." Huai Chaoshu raised her head and narrowed her eyes. After a long period of silence, she suddenly opened her mouth and asked, "What's the situation in the north? Are there any movements in the underground tunnels?" Jesse was slightly startled. He thought to himself that although the plan had set up 3 interception lines in the North Bank, how could that fugitive from the Federation be so stupid as to walk into the city? "According to your instructions, the microchip monitoring system in the underground tunnels has been completely activated at the first moment. It's just that there may be some small problems due to the equipment in a few nodes not being maintained for a long time. However, it won't affect the overall situation." Huai Chaoshu didn't say anything. She only narrowed her eyes even more, and her neat eyelashes flashed like sharp knives. Immediately after, bad news came. The troops in charge of searching for anyone in the underground tunnels were confirmed to have been attacked 3 times, and no one survived. "Your Highness, I specifically moved Qi Dabin to the underground tunnels. In the end, even he was knocked down. Right now, we don't know if he's still alive." Jesse wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He didn't have time to express his shock. He quickly explained that he didn't underestimate Her Highness' initial order. Huai Chaoshu frowned. She knew that Qi Dabin was a powerful soldier from the Royal Special Forces. She didn't expect that even that person couldn't stop Su Lu. How can you move when you're supposed to be paralyzed? You've lost so much blood and suffered such heavy injuries. How can you still run so far away? You followed the underground tunnels to the capital. Don't you know that I can grab the leash behind your neck at any time? Looking at the night sky outside the window, Huai Chaoshu expressionlessly talked to the fugitive. "Completely seal off the exit of the underground tunnels." "Yes," Chief Jesse replied in a deep voice. Although he knew that it was impossible to completely seal off the complex and terrifying underground sewer system of the Tianjing planet, when he thought of the microchip on the back of the fugitive's neck and the monitoring devices all over the city, his confidence returned to him. The window rolled down, and the night wind blew in. There was a long period of silence, and there was no feedback. His confidence gradually collapsed. Jessie's face was filled with disbelief and nervousness. Huaichaosher narrowed her eyes and looked at the trees on the street that were swaying uneasily in the night wind. For the first time, she felt uneasy. Has there ever been a person from the Federation who could survive on Tianjing for an hour? She thought of the cold question she had asked earlier, and a bad omen suddenly appeared in her heart. Now, an hour had passed, and there was still no sign of Su Lu. Only then did she remember that she had forgotten something. Many years ago, that person from the Federation called Nasri had lived on Tianjing planet for a very long time and had even lived there for a very long time. A burst of gunfire that was not beautiful was spat out. The muffled gunshot reverberated in the spacious and quiet underground tunnels for a long time before it slowly disappeared. In a dark corner, Su Lu held the standard gun of the Empire's military. He stared at the platform in the distance with a determined expression. After observing for a long time and confirming that the 6 soldiers from the Empire had all been killed by him, he started walking forward again. This was the 3rd batch of soldiers from the Empire that he had encountered during his escape in the underground tunnels. In a sudden exchange of gunfire, he used his eyesight that was much sharper than the average person's and the marksmanship that Bai Yulan had practiced to quickly eliminate the enemies. Old thing, even without your eyes, my marksmanship is still awesome. He dragged his injured leg and limped forward with difficulty. There was no expression on his tired face, but he was constantly cheering himself on in his heart. He had been on the run for more than an hour. He knew that even if the Empire had not discovered him yet, he would be exposed soon. More importantly, the closer he got to Tianjing along the underground tunnels, the more likely it was that he would encounter a chip monitoring device. It was time to take out the chip behind his neck, but he kept hesitating. Yes, I will still write. Today, I will probably write through the night. The next chapter will be very late. Those who can't take it will sleep first. I will try my best to make up for what I owe. I don't have time to edit it, so it may be a little rough. Please understand. Chapter 616. The sofa in the condominium in Wangdu was not too short. Su Lu liked to nestle on it and watch Channel 23 with snacks in his arms. This showed that his life was actually as warm and harmonious as many ordinary young people. However, many things that happened in the past few years were enough to prove that once he was forced into a corner by his environment or his own obsession, he would always squint his eyes and smash his way through with a straight face. He acted out the words decisive and ruthless in an exceptionally vivid manner. Removing the chip from the back of his neck and avoiding the surveillance of the Empire, he quietly entered the vast sea of people in the capital city. Using the prosperity of the common world to hide his tracks, he patiently waited for the Empire to reveal any gaps. He would find all possible ways to leave this planet, infiltrate the border star system, prepare to face the counterattack of the federal forces, or directly pass through the passage of the Night Scorpion Nebula and return to his hometown. This was his initial escape plan. Once the plan was set, with his personality, he would resolutely carry it out without any hesitation. Therefore, today's hesitation was not because of the confusion of his identity as an artsy youth or because his spirit was bleak after being severed from the past. It was because of a very simple reason. He was afraid of pain. To be more precise, he was afraid of fainting from the pain and becoming a pitiful unconscious prey under the iron hooves of the Empire's search and capture forces. In the autumn of the 65th year of the constitutional era, he began the first escape of his life, an escape that changed the trajectory of his life. At the beginning of that escape, he replaced the chip on the back of his neck. As a result, he was unconscious for an entire night in the green hills and autumn forest during the storm. Now, 5 years had passed in the blink of an eye, and he began to escape again. However, the pain that humans could not endure and could only passively resist by fainting was still fresh in his mind. He did not dare to forget it, and there was still lingering fear in his heart. If it was when he was in the Federation, he still dared to look for a secluded place to gamble. Now, countless Imperial soldiers were searching for him. Once he fainted from the pain, he would fall into the sea of death forever. Moving forward with difficulty in the underground sewers, with the help of the sewer's map and his bracelet, he originally wanted to find a safe place to replace the chip on the back of his neck. However, he did not expect the Imperial armies to be so aggressive in their pursuit. There was no good opportunity at all. In the underground sewer that was as dark as the passage of time, he carried his gun and stepped on his military boots that were constantly wearing out. He looked at the map and moved forward in silence. However, the question kept echoing in his mind: to gamble or not to gamble? It took him a total of 3 minutes to come up with the answer. 300 meters away, in a dark corner without any light, Su Lu took a deep breath as he looked at the iron gate of the outer passage in the distance. A fierce look flashed across his swollen and squinted eyes as his left hand, which was hanging by his waist, suddenly tightened. The metal wire in the bracelet slowly extended like a ghost and aimed at the bare skin behind his neck. The surroundings were pitch black, but the metal wire reflected the light from somewhere. The extremely thin and sharp metal wire swayed gently in his slightly trembling hand, as if it would snap with a crisp sound if it swayed a little more. Su Lu took another deep breath and then closed his eyes. His left hand moved closer to the back of his neck again. When the metal wire was 3 centimeters away from the back of his neck, the sharp tip of the wire suddenly trembled strangely. It was like a hungry bee that suddenly smelled the scent of enchanting nectar. It quickly flapped its transparent wings excitedly. Tiny and invisible electric charges continuously condensed at the tip of the metal wire, and an extremely small electromagnetic field enveloped the area behind his neck. A small bump slowly appeared on his bare skin. Su Li's face was expressionless, and his eyes were tightly closed. He could feel the strange feeling behind his neck, but he did not have any reaction. Although the last time he replaced the chip was 5 years ago, he remembered every detail very clearly. The sewage under the underground platform slowly flowed, and the dry air was full of the smell of decay. Suddenly, the tip of the metal wire extended automatically and accurately pierced the bump on the back of his neck. Then it kept vibrating and probing into the cervical vertebrae. The intense pain went along the nerve bundles in the cervical vertebrae and fiercely blasted into the brain. Su Li's half-kneeling body suddenly stiffened. His tightly closed eyes suddenly opened, and his face twisted in pain. The burning heat and the endless pain in his body intertwined, and it seemed that he was about to burn into ashes. A few minutes later, a trembling figure stretched out his right hand with difficulty and touched the heavy iron door. He walked out of the underground sewer and climbed up the old-style stairs to the surface. When he climbed out of the ground, he half-crouched in a bush to rest for a while. Then the figure painfully struggled to stand up again and continued to move forward. He looked like a dying, seriously ill patient who could fall to the ground and die at any time. Fortunately, he did not faint from the pain. Unfortunately, he needed to be awake to endure the increasingly intense pain. The joints where the chip was implanted in his cervical vertebrae were so painful that they were about to shatter, and his fingers were starting to feel numb. The night was dark, and there was not a single person on the streets in the southwest of Tianjin. Su Lu, with a pale face, followed the green field by the street, moving his body that was constantly trembling because of the pain. His trembling body brushed against the bush, making a rustling sound. Fortunately, the night wind was strong, and the branches of the trees brushed against each other from time to time, covering the sound that could possibly expose his whereabouts. Because he did not faint, he could clearly feel the strange feeling and unbearable pain behind his neck more clearly than 5 years ago. He dragged his injured leg slowly in the grass, and his weak body that was about to be unable to support him anymore. He did not even notice that his teeth had bitten through his lips, and the small amount of blood that was originally not much dripped onto his military uniform. A person who was extremely sleepy would not be able to see the bed. A person who was extremely hungry would not be able to see the food, and a person who was in extreme pain would not be able to relax in the slightest. At this moment, Sue Lee's heart was filled with endless temptation. He wanted to collapse right here and now, so that he would never wake up again. He was not willing to endure this terrifying pain and torture. Other than the pain, there was also a strange feeling of emptiness. This time, he was not replacing the chip, but executing the program to remove it. Since he was born more than 20 years ago, this was the first time that there was no chip at the back of his neck. Although the people of the Federation could not feel the existence of the chip, their rationality told them that the chip was not there. That feeling was like one of their organs had suddenly disappeared, and it was inexplicable. The pain and emptiness of the frustration, the unknown danger ahead, and the desire to faint constantly assaulted him. Sulu tightly pursed his lips, resisting with superhuman willpower. Perhaps it was because in the hospital, during the days when his entire body was paralyzed and he forcefully broke through his meridians, he had already endured too many levels of pain that were rarely seen in the world, so he managed to hold on, even though it was very difficult. Fortunately, the pain and suffering were worth it. After leaving the underground sewer system and entering the heavily guarded surface of the city, he did not alarm the ubiquitous monitoring devices of the Empire's chip. However, the danger still existed. After struggling for a long time in the gaps between the residential apartment buildings, a straight and empty road blocked his way. What was even more troublesome was that there were many military police at the entrance of the road, vigilantly watching the surrounding movements. The target of his plan was the chaotic slum area that lacked effective supervision a few kilometers away. If he had no choice but to stay in this residential area, it would be very difficult for him to avoid the military police's search during the day. The road in front of him was not very wide. If he was in his usual healthy state, he would only need to bend his body and take a few steps to pass by without alarming the military police at all. However, the problem was that he was in his weakest state right now and could collapse at any time. The dim street lights, through the bushes, fell on his pale cheeks. He narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction, waiting for the right time. However, he found that, because of the pain and exhaustion, his vision began to blur. He could not hold on any longer. At this moment, a seemingly drunk Empire man staggered across the sidewalk at the edge of the bushes, mumbling something in his mouth, and rushed to the other side of the street. Probably only the extremely drunk Empire people could ignore the gloomy faces of the military police, and they did not know that there was a curfew tonight. The military police at the entrance of the road became nervous. They shouted and surrounded the drunk man. The military police, who did not move, also subconsciously looked in that direction. Sula did not let go of this fleeting opportunity. He struggled to take a deep breath of the slightly cold autumn night wind of the Empire. His throat that seemed to be smoking slightly moistened. His right leg that had already sunk deep into the mud suddenly exerted strength, and the military pants on his leg were torn apart. The last burst of strength caused his body to turn into a gray shadow and instantly swept across the street. He fell heavily into the mud. He did not dare to make the slightest sound. He continued to lie there for a long time, resisting the strong desire to faint from his brain. After confirming that the military police did not discover him, he carefully raised his body with his hands on the ground and looked back at the entrance of the road. The drunk man, who could be regarded as a savior, had been brutally beaten to the ground by the military police with a taser. He was rolling on the ground in pain. Sula narrowed his eyes and was silent for a moment. Then he turned his head back. He struggled to walk through the alley with wet flagstones. He held onto the wall to pass through the small paths between the buildings. He painfully used his hands and feet to climb over the low walls. In this strange and foreign city, he slowly but firmly moved forward. His body was getting colder and colder, and his trembling was getting worse and worse. He felt like his left leg was broken, and he could not feel anything. His vision was getting blurrier and blurrier. The night was still so dark, and the main street of the city was still so dangerous. After rolling and crawling into the messy and dirty street, he still did not dare to relax his vigilance. His back was against a short wall mottled with gray stains, and his chest was violently moving up and down. There was a roof on the wall, and dew gently dripped down from the roof onto his face. He subconsciously raised his head and took a sip. The tip of his tongue slid across his dry lips. His spirit was slightly better. Sulu observed the messy environment around him. He followed the corner of the wall into a dilapidated small courtyard, and then used the last of his strength to climb up the dusty attic. Opposite the attic, there was a stray cat. It was curled up in the green grass that grew out of the corner of the roof. It curiously opened its eyes and looked at this strange guy. Chapter 617. Are you going? Of course I'm going. I heard that the best trees in the plaza were all taken by the students from the West City. If we are late, I'm afraid we won't be able to see anything. I don't want to go, but there definitely won't be any business in the market. Sure. Look at the officials at the management office. I shouldn't have said that. Let's go. Our empire hasn't had such a big event for many years. Who said that? I participated in the celebration ceremony after the big explosion 20 years ago. That scene, don't say so much. Everyone, let's go together. Let's go together. Let's go together. Let's go together. Listening to the excited conversations of the nearby people, a trace of disgust and helplessness flashed across Aunt Susan's chubby face. Looking at the people rushing out of the market like fish that had eaten drugs, she could not help but curse in a low voice in annoyance. Wiping the dust stains on her hands on her apron, she walked to the management office and took a small flag that was distributed to her. Stepping on a mud and cigarette butts, she joined the crowd. Today, the city's underground transportation system was all open for free. People from all over the city were continuously sent to the empty square of the Arc de Triomphe. It didn't take long for the people from the slums in the northwest to enter the sea of people that was faintly moving. Susan looked at the small flag in her hand. She felt that the black hibiscus flower on the flag was a little dazzling. The hand that was holding the flag was sweaty and uncomfortable. She was like a puppet, waving the flag mechanically along with the excited people around her. However, she kept cursing in her heart. Today was the 723rd year of the Empire's Hibiscus dynasty. The nobles' rebellion that caused a commotion a few days ago had been completely quelled. According to the imperial edict, a small number of ambitious nobles took advantage of the fact that the enemy of the Federation was closing in to launch a barbaric rebellion against the glorious imperial family. In this rebellion, the respected military minister of the Empire, Prince Bai Wu, heroically sacrificed himself. Li Banstar's governor, Ke Bouning, bravely sacrificed himself for the country. Now that the rebellion had been quelled, it was time to punish the evil of those ambitious nobles. His Majesty, the great emperor, summoned the citizens of Tianjing Planet from all walks of life to the Triumphal Arch Plaza to witness this righteous trial. After a long period of silence and anxious anticipation, it was finally time for the gallows to be erected. Looking at the primitive black gallows being lifted up by cranes and the noble criminals with black cloth covering their heads being escorted out by the soldiers, the sea of people suddenly let out the first wave of cheers. With the center of the square as the center, a wave formed by heads rose one after another and spread out. A pale-faced and haggard noble was escorted to the gallows. After taking off his black mask, he was not used to the light in the gloomy day. He narrowed his eyes and looked around in fear, but he was even more frightened by the countless excited faces of the civilians around the gallows. He wanted to say something, but no words came out. The Empire's chief judge passionately read the verdict, and then, without any pause, the crisp metal door opened. The noble fell straight into the circular hole, and the black noose around his neck was pulled taut. Since the start of the execution, the crowd of spectators in the square had maintained absolute silence. It had been many years since they had seen such a vivid and bloody execution scene. The crowd's expectations were high and did not fall. It was not until this scene that they seemed to have woken up. They seemed to have clearly heard the sound of the noose ruthlessly breaking the nobleman's vertebrae. They could not help but shout excitedly. Aunt Susan looked at the gallows in the distance with a complicated expression and couldn't help but close her eyes. The nobles were executed one after another. Their necks were broken by the black noose, and they stopped breathing. Every time the black noose was pulled taut, and every time the noble's body fell down heavily, it would cause the tens of thousands of people in the square to shout excitedly. Especially when the noble women were executed, the emotions of the people in the square were extremely excited. The sweaty male commoners, the poor, and the untouchables widened their eyes as they watched the noble women's jade-white calves kick in the air in vain, twitching until they became quiet, as if they were watching an exciting private performance in broad daylight. They couldn't help but sigh in satisfaction, but their faces immediately changed into a mask of shyness, timidity, and pity. Aunt Susan was pushed around by the excited crowd. Looking at the young ladies of the noble families who were hung, she tightened her grip on the black hibiscus flag. She pursed her lips tighter and tighter, and her thick eyebrows tighter and tighter. She let out a real sigh in her heart. The trial was over. Aunt Susan rubbed her slightly dizzy forehead and walked to the subway entrance listlessly. It was the imperial edict for the civilians to come to watch the trial, and the royal family flag that she was holding was an anti-distribution item of the Federation. She had to come. However, she didn't need to participate in the parade later, and she didn't want to. On the way back to the market by public transport, she saw tens of thousands of young men of the Empire marching outside the car window. Those boys were waving flags, shouting slogans like "Long live His Majesty" and "Punish the traitors." They were fanatically walking through the streets and alleys of the city. Aunt Susan walked into the muddy streets and bought a lot of cheap vegetables from a market. After paying the principal and interest for this month's quota, she carried the vegetables back to her shabby courtyard and handed them to the pair of hands that reached out from the side room. At the same time, she took a batch of goods from the pair of hands that needed to be sold and put them on her three-wheeled electric scooter. After carefully checking the quantity of the goods, Aunt Susan found that something was wrong. She finally couldn't help but burst out in anger. She put her hands on her bucket-like waist and scolded the person next to her. "You are so clumsy. You can't even do a simple job like assembling a few broken machines. Do you think I feed you for free? I don't know how expensive you are." Aunt Susan suddenly thought of something and stopped scolding. She glanced at the entrance of the courtyard vigilantly, spat on the ground, and started the electric scooter to drive out of the courtyard. Today, Aunt Susan was a rude woman who lived in the slums of the capital. She relied on selling pirated video players and the Empire's minimum wage to survive. Many years ago, she was also a delicate noble lady. She had a pair of jade-like legs like those noble ladies on the gallows in the square today. Her parents, who were middle-class nobles, were secretly executed because they were involved in a struggle between the 6 departments of the Empire. She, who was lucky enough to survive, and she and her brother depended on each other in the only house left by the family. Later, her firm and gentle brother bravely joined the Imperial Expeditionary Force in order to restore the glory of the family. However, many years later, Susan welcomed the bad news that her brother violated military discipline and was executed. The last house of the family could no longer be preserved. Susan, who had a hard life, fell into the slums. She was extremely lucky to meet a husband who loved her and cared for her. However, after only 3 years of marriage, her husband fell ill and died, leaving only her and her son to depend on each other. The noble lady who would frown when she stepped on small pebbles in her gorgeous dancing shoes, under the merciless grinding of fate, became an auntie with a shrewish character, a bucket-like waist, and hard-soled imitation military boots. She could step on the muddy water in the market and make the sound of splashing water. The strong or obese body pressed on the small electric scooter looked funny, but for some reason it was also sad. In the market, a fierce quarrel broke out again with the male competitors. Relying on her superior lung capacity and extremely filthy verbal attack, Aunt Susan won another victory. She successfully occupied the best mobile stall in the market sold 2 pirated video and audio players, and then gave 60% of the profit to the market management office and the tattooed hooligans with both hands. She beamed with joy and offered 60% of the profit to the market management office and the tattooed hooligans with both hands. She wanted to live, and she wanted to live with her son. She needed to quarrel day after day. She needed to succeed day after day, and she needed to give her hard-earned money to those parasites with a smile every day. However, every time she returned to the dilapidated small courtyard late at night, the energy in her strong body would be completely consumed by these successful quarrels and smiles. Aunt Susan was extremely tired. In the dark alley, she leaned weakly against the courtyard door, thinking of the argument with the old guy in the afternoon, thinking of the dirty words that she didn't dare to let her son hear, and thinking of the reservedness of her teenage years. She couldn't help but raise her calloused hands, covered her weathered cheeks, and slowly squatted down. Oh, what a life it was! For a hard life, memories were a luxury that could only be found once in a while. Even sadness was a luxury, because it would make life more difficult. Aunt Susan stubbornly stood up straight, patted the dust on her big buttocks, murmured a few words in a low voice, and then turned around and walked into her small courtyard. Her life still had hope, and her well-behaved and sensible son, who was studying at the second university in the capital. Her difficult life was no longer all gray and black because of that boy. According to her income, it was absolutely impossible for her to pay the expensive tuition fees of the second university. Fortunately, His Majesty had promoted the Equal Education Program, which allowed excellent students like her son to have the right to study for free and equal. Because of this, Aunt Susan, who deeply hated the imperial family for half of her life, quickly forgave His Majesty. After parking the scooter, she climbed up the small attic with difficulty. She had become a rude but kind woman. With her arms akimbo and her index finger as thick as a branch, she angrily scolded the black-haired young man who was in a daze deep in the dark room. "How many have you assembled in the past 4 hours? How can there be such a stupid person like you?" The black-haired young man bitterly rubbed his face. Those faint scars were no longer clear. He looked at the sturdy woman at the door and helplessly explained in a low voice, "I told you yesterday that the goods your boss gave you were not right. There was a problem with the model of the spinner on the bayonet, and I couldn't screw it at all. I had to polish them one by one. Of course, it took a long time." Chapter 618. The dim light shone on the black-haired young man's face. After hearing this sentence, his ink-like straight eyebrows suddenly trembled, but he didn't say anything. When Aunt Susan saw his reaction, she thought that her words had touched his sad soul. She couldn't help but feel a little regretful and hesitantly shut her mouth. She casually made some small talk and walked downstairs, patting the back of her head regretfully. 10 days ago, Aunt Susan, who had gotten up early in the morning to prepare for a day's work, was shocked to find a black-haired young man covered in blood lying on the dusty floor of her house in a deep coma. He looked abnormally terrifying. Aunt Susan was very bold. After confirming that he was unconscious, she dragged him to the straw mat and carefully sized him up. From this person's military uniform and boots that didn't fit his feet, she made her own judgment of this person's identity. During those days, the capital of Tianjin was filled with gloomy military police and plainclothes from the Royal Intelligence Agency. The royal family was wantonly searching for remnants of the aristocratic rebellion. Aunt Susan thought that the black-haired young man covered in blood on the straw mat was definitely a noble being hunted down. In the end, what confirmed her judgment was a corner of the black-haired young man's underwear exposed at his waist. As a young lady of the aristocratic family, she was very clear about the material of that underwear. Only the truly wealthy upper-class aristocrats were qualified to use it. Aunt Susan now seemed to have forgotten the tragedy of her family's destruction. She didn't have much hatred for His Majesty and the royal family, nor did she have the courage to involve herself in the aristocratic rebellion and capture a fugitive. At that time, her first reaction was to call the police. However, at that moment, the unconscious black-haired young man woke up for a brief moment. It was in that moment that his small eyes revealed a weakness that aroused endless pity, amiable sincerity, and sincere pleading. He didn't know what kind of struggle Aunt Susan had experienced at that time. He didn't know if she saw the shadow of her parents in this poor, fugitive nobleman, or if she remembered that her brother who loved her the most also had such a pair of clear eyes. She didn't call the police. She hid him in the attic of the small courtyard, hiding him in the dust. She fed him plain porridge and water, helped him clean his miserable body that was full of wounds, crushed the pills, and stuffed them into his mouth until he woke up. The black-haired young man's first words of thanks after waking up made Aunt Susan confirm her guess again. How many years had it been since she heard that standard Tianjin aristocratic, no, to be more precise, royal accent? This little guy's parents must be important figures. Aunt Susan was busy in the kitchen downstairs. The kitchen knife made chopping sounds on the plastic chopping board and muttered with a trace of annoyance. But what's the use of aristocrats? You can't eat it. You only know how to speak elegantly, but you don't even know how to turn a screw. The cheap vegetables bought in the market during the day were chopped into pieces by the old kitchen knife and thrown into the pot of porridge. Together with a few slices of meat and a spoonful of yellowish-brown spices, the pot of steaming, appetizing chowder was ready. Aunt Susan clapped her hands proudly. When she was about to put the food in the pot on the plate, she suddenly thought of the poor noble's pale face in the attic. After a long silence, she couldn't help but sigh deeply. She took out the black feather chicken and red oranges that she had prepared for her son on the weekend from the refrigerator and threw them into the pot. In the future, I can't be such a good person anymore. There's no benefit, and I have to live in fear every day. As she stirred the food, she wiped the sweat on her forehead and blamed herself. Black feather chicken and red oranges are good for replenishing blood. You picked them out and ate them. Aunt Susan angrily threw the small bowl in front of the black-haired young man and said, "Quickly take care of your body, woman, and then get the hell out of here." The black-haired young man held the bowl that was slightly hot. After a long silence, he slowly picked up the chopsticks and began to eat. After finishing the food in the bowl, he raised his head and looked at Aunt Susan, who had been leaning against the pillar. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he didn't say anything. Perhaps it was because the food was too hot. That pair of small eyes that still had some traces of swelling were sparkling. "Don't look at me like a puppy. The remaining half of the chicken is for Paul. Don't expect me to cook it for you." Aunt Susan grumpily snatched the bowl away. The black-haired young man looked at her and chuckled. "But don't be in a hurry to leave." Aunt Susan couldn't stand the poor aristocrat's clean and harmless smile. She waved the rag in her right hand as if she wanted to wave the smile away. She said in a serious tone, "I heard that recently there were fugitives from the Federation who ran out." Of course, the Joint Defense Office didn't say anything. It's gossip from the underworld. The military and police are looking for people everywhere. You have to be careful. "I'm not from the Federation." "I'm not afraid," the black-haired young man replied. "Not afraid? If the military catches you, a fugitive aristocrat, I'm afraid your end will be much worse than that of the Federation's." Aunt Susan said in a rough voice, "Forget it. You can stay here for a while. The household registration check here has never been strict. Who knows how many fugitives are hidden in the 4 major markets. They won't be able to find you in a short time. You can say that you're a distant relative of my family, but..." Aunt Susan frowned and looked at him. "You have to change your accent. This is an authentic royal accent. Sigh." She sighed and took the utensils to wash. Before she went downstairs, her rough voice sounded again. "You have to be more familiar with the way of life. I don't expect you to make money for me, but you can't live off your parents in the future. You have to learn some skills to make a living, right?" Seeing Aunt Susan turn out of the attic like a moving and rotating bucket, hearing the heavy footsteps below, and then hearing the familiar and kind cursing in the kitchen, Sulu rubbed his black hair. His heart was filled with endless warmth and gratitude. He had a lot of dreams and nightmares when he was in a coma. The most frightening dream was when he woke up and saw the cold muzzles of countless Empire soldiers pointing at him. The heavy wolf Fong Mek was guarding the periphery, and Huai Chaoshi was slowly walking toward him with a cold face. He didn't expect that when he woke up, he would be greeted by a bowl of warm porridge and a very kind and gentle aunt who looked fierce on the outside. This was really the luckiest thing in life. He was very grateful to this empire woman named Susan, but on some issues, he had to lie to her and acquiesce to her guess. He pretended to be a poor young noble wanted by the empire regime. The kind Aunt Susan could take the risk to take in a noble because of her past and her sympathy, but she was certainly unwilling to take in a person from the Federation. After waking up, he found that he was mistaken for a noble of the empire, and this misunderstanding was very firm in his aunt's heart. Sulu also felt a little strange. It was not until now that he remembered that his empire language was basically learned from Huai Chaoshi. With the standard royal language and pronunciation of the princess, it was difficult not to be misunderstood. Aunt Susan's son, Paul, was studying at the second university. Her daily life was very lonely, so she seemed to be a little naggy. And Sulu deduced a lot of things from her nagging, some of which he had learned from Huai Chaoshi but didn't pay attention to. In the past, the empire's social class division was very strict. The royal family, the nobles, the civilians, the lowly, and the slaves formed the layer structure of this abnormal society. And to distinguish whether a person was a noble or not, there was a not very reliable but widely spread method among the people. That was to look at the color of the person's hair and eyes. The closer the color of the hair and eyes were to black, the more noble the identity of the person was. Sulu thought of Huai Caoshi's dark eyes that were always squinting and couldn't help but frown. That year, in the Qingcheng prison of the Federation, it seemed that the great old man said something vaguely related, but it was too long ago to remember clearly. It seemed that the old man said, "If you can remove the chip, you can go to the Empire and pretend to be a member of the royal family?" Why? Could it be that the old man had already guessed that he could remove the chip from the back of his neck because of his black hair and shiny black eyes? Su Li's frowning brows gradually relaxed, but his eyes narrowed. He slowly moved his body and leaned on the windowsill, looking at the moon outside the attic that should be strange but was similar to the Federation's moon. His mind drifted away. The sound of testing came from the dilapidated, small courtyard below the attic. The ants seemed to be playing a war movie. The metal box hanging at the entrance of the small courtyard should be the chip monitoring device that the Empire distributed to all families for free. That box never rang. Sulu subconsciously reached out and touched the back of his neck. The tiny wound had already healed. He understood that it was because the box never rang that Aunt Susan and Paul never suspected that he was a member of the Federation. But I am a member of the Federation. I have to leave the land of the Empire. What should I do? Sulu narrowed his eyes at the moon in a foreign land and fell into contemplation again. I don't know how the Empire's search is going. They haven't found me for so long. Will they think that I am dead? No. According to the temperament of the princess, she will not give up until the body is found. This shabby little courtyard could be considered a decent building in this slum area. But because it was too close to the crematorium, not many people were willing to choose to live here. The surrounding buildings were all dark, and the silence was just like his mood at the moment. Sulu withdrew his gaze, shook his head, and sat back on the straw mat. He dragged out a big box from the corner, picked up the rough tools, and began to seriously assemble the inferior and cheap pirated video player. The big problem of escaping from the Empire and returning to the Federation couldn't be solved in a short time, but he had to solve the most troublesome problem in front of him first. But this snapper is really the wrong model, Ant. He looked at the screws with a bitter face and found that this problem was more troublesome than escaping. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.